and everything falls apart. We will call to order this work session of the Board of Trustees for Tuesday, April 9th, 2019. And Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Yes, I will. Good morning, everybody. Roll call. Trustee Calvert.
Here.
Trustee Custodial.
Here.
President Simon Holland.
Here.
Trustee Kelly.
Here.
Trustee Minetto.
Here.
Trustee Raymond, Vice President Raymond.
Here.
And I am here. The student obviously won't be here. She's in class, which is where we all want her to be.
That's right.
And we have a quorum, Madam President.
Thank you. Dr. Deputy, would you be willing to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance this morning? Thank you.
Ready, begin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you so much.
She's such a teacher. Ready, begin.
I know. That's good. Do we have any public comment this morning, Ms. JJ? Okay, so we will close the public comment and go on to action to adopt the agenda. Would anyone make a motion to adopt the agenda? So moved by Dr. Taylor. Is there a second by Trustee Calvert? Was that Calvert or Raymond? Okay, Vice President Raymond. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you very much. And now we will go on to our business of the morning, presentation by staff and discussion by the board regarding the fiscal year 2019-20 budget for all district funds, update regarding the structural budget deficit for the general fund, update of board budget requests, discussion of the budget timeline, and discussion of possible action to approve the tentative budget. And Mr. Mathers, welcome, and I'll let you introduce your colleagues that are presenting with you.
Thank you, Madam President, members of the board. Here with me this morning is Mike Schroeder, our budget director, and Jeff Bazzo, our budget project manager. Today is the day in which we are asking you to adopt or provide direction to us on the tentative budget that we are required to submit to the state by April 15th. And so we will go through our assumptions in developing budget. We actually have several kind of variations to that tentative budget, and we are asking for direction from you as to which version you would like us to submit to the state. So our agenda here today, first of all, Mike will go through what we have termed our baseline tentative budget. And so for comparability's sake, we constructed this baseline budget assuming a level of COLA that is close to prior years. Just so that for comparability's sake, you would have something to compare to. And then in item 2, Mike will go through a very technical issue in 2A, but one that has a large fiscal impact on Washoe County School District. And then we will talk about version 2.0 of the tentative budget, if you will, that is predicated on a 3% cost of living adjustment. Our next item, number 3, we have analysis for you regarding athletic transportation fees, one of the special requests that you had asked about, and Jeff will walk you through the analysis that we've done there. Item 4, we will turn it over to departments to explain scenarios in which they looked at a 5% reduction, 10% reduction, and 20% reduction. And then, time allowing, we can quickly cover other district funds. Obviously, the bulk of this presentation is focused on our general fund, but we have information on other district funds. And then the last item, again, we can talk about timeline and steps going forward. So with that, I will turn it over to Mike to begin the discussion of the tentative budget.
Thank you, Mark.
Mike.
Good morning, President Simon Holland, Deputy Superintendent McNeil, and members of the board. We got a lot of things to talk about today. When we started this whole process, we kind of gave you an outline of how the budget is built, and different things become known at different periods of time. So we're at a time where we know quite a bit, and we still have other things we need to find out or work on, but essentially what it amounts to is once you look at your revenues and determine what you think you're going to get versus the expenditures that you think you're going to have, there's always a difference. And we already knew up front that we had a $7.5 million budget structural deficit rolling forward. That just moves into the current year. We knew we had new schools, multi-track year would be going out, things like that. So a lot of these things we already discussed, and some of these will be new for today. But you end up in that critical red area where the revenues always seem to be less than the expenditures, so somehow you have to manage a way to reduce your budget or find new revenues to make this thing balance. And this is just kind of a similar slide. When we started, we talked about our deficit rolling forward. We talked about things that we could control that were kind of within our control. We said we could shift some funds out of the general fund to our government service tax fund to help offset that existing deficit and the new school costs. March 12th, we presented some budget reductions related to our priority-based budgeting process. These were ideas that seemed to be less impactful, and you as a board seemed to indicate that you were okay with those. And one of them that we'll talk about a little more here too was the bell schedule change. Still to go now. We know we have better idea of some of our revenues, pretty solid numbers on our projections for salary and benefits, and some issues and some areas with the state funding are things we're going to talk about here. Plus, beyond this all, there's a new funding model that they're talking about. It's proposed right now. We don't know where that's going to go. That's still up to the legislature to decide. So those are things that will be happening after this session. So this is just kind of a summary, a recap of where we've been. We started with our structural deficit. We knew we had to put new schools in. We could offset a portion of that by losing schools that were on multi-track, which saves us a little money. But we're almost at an $11 million deficit at that point. We said we could shift money from our debts general fund to our government services taxes fund to pay for debt service. And we've seen that our salary and benefit, by the time we get to the end of the year, we're typically saving more than what we had in the budget. We already had in the budget about $4 million for this, and we're upping that to $6 million. So those are kind of things we're saying are within our control. At that point, we still had a $6 million deficit. We talked about the March 12th items for reduction. And in this item, this $1.27 million, it doesn't include the AP stipends. We had that on the list back in March 12th as one of the items to reduce. It's not included in this number. But we did add the change in the bell schedule. It seemed like there was a appetite to do something like that given the extensive amount of our budget deficit. So I want to point that out. Right now, what we have in this tentative budget is that bell schedule change.
Mike, can you just clarify what was the amount of the AP stipend? I mean, does it offset if the bell schedules can't happen for next year?
It was $168,000.
Okay, so it's not quite equivalent. Okay.
So at this point in time, these are kind of things that are within our control. Obviously, we still have more budget reductions to do based on this to balance the budget, but these are the things we're saying right now we know about, or we knew about, and we can control. So now we want to move into some of these other issues that we really haven't talked about yet. We know in the governor's proposed budget, the per pupil amount statewide goes up 1.42%. So if we apply that to our own existing per pupil amount for fiscal year 19, then we can try to extrapolate what we possibly could get. But that inside state revenues also includes LSST and 1/3 of our property tax. So LSST, this is based on Department of Taxation's.
Local school support tax.
Yes. Thank you for correcting me.
No, it's not a correction, just
Local
an
school
addition.
support tax, so which is basically sales tax in Nevada for Washoe County. But every time that goes up $1, the state DSA portion goes down. Right now, based on Department of Taxation final revenue projections, ours is projected to go up by $14.3 million. So in this budget, automatically the state DSA goes down by that amount. So when you see it decrease, it's because that's going up. Then the state builds a 6.5% ad valorem growth into their budget. We now have our actual pro forma ad valorem projection from the Department of Taxation, and that's right around 6%. So we lose a little money on that because we can't budget 6.5 if we're only going to get 6. So that increase is about 6.6 million totally. 2.2 million of that is offset to the DSA. That's that 1/3 portion. And then our charter school enrollment has grown. Charter schools get a portion of our local revenues that amounts to almost about $1,400 per student. So there's a little offset for that growth that we've seen over the last year. Local revenues, we talked about property taxes being up 6%, government services taxes were at 7.5% increase, which is about 1.4 million. And some investment earnings and indirect cost revenue increases. The total of all these is about $11.4 million. Sorry. Now on the expenditure side, salaries, we take our employees and roll them up on salary schedules. Each group rolls up a little bit differently. If you look at our professional technical schedule or our classified ESP schedule, each of those steps is about 2.85%. But then you go to the teacher's schedule and it increments the same dollar amount in every step, so it could be from 2% to 4%, depending on where you're at on those steps. And when you go to the administrator's schedule, it could be a 2 or 3 or 4%. So the average of all those, once you roll them up, is about 2.27, which is, I think when the state builds their budget, they assume a 2%. So if we're really 2.27, we'd be falling behind a little bit on that. Benefits, we knew there would be an increase in the retirement rate. That's going up 1.25% statewide for a typical employee. And half of that gets offset to the employee's salary. So the employee salary goes down by 0.62 or so. And overall, that costs us about $1.25 million. The roll-ups at the top are about $7.76 million for those costs. The salary increases, which we've done in the past, and being consistent with that, is about $3.36 million. And group insurance under the benefits is almost $3.8 million for a 10% increase. Special education, what happens there, all the things we're talking about in this general fund are happening over in the special education fund. You have roll-ups, you have a health insurance impact, you got a PERS increase, all those different factors. Statewide, there's a proposed increase, I believe, of about $1.4 million or $14 million for special education funding. We typically get about 10% of that, so we've included about a $1.4 million increase. But once again, compared to the roll-ups and salaries and health insurance, those total about $3.48 million. The revenue is 1.4, so we're in the hole a little over $2 million just for that also. Then otherwise, there's some smaller changes we made to various stuff that nets out to about break even, so nothing really new there and no new mandates that we've put in the budget either. We're going to skip forward to this slide and then go back to that one. So kind of to summarize what I just said, we talked about, okay, we got a deficit that's within our control right now. That was about $4.63 million. We talked about these new revenues. It's 11.4 million roughly. New expenditures are about 16.2. So just the nature of how the funding is working right now, it's not paying, the new revenues aren't paying for our new expenditures, and it increases our deficit by 4.8 million. So right now we will be sitting, based under this scenario, which we're going to talk about some other scenarios here too, we'd be sitting at a deficit of $9.44 million.
So this is kind of a summary of the changes in revenues and expenses Mike just went through. In total for the fiscal year 20 budget, as Mike noted, We see revenues going up 11.4 million. So total sources in this scenario would be 476 million, and total uses in this scenario would be 485 million. Again, that's a deficit of 9.44 million. And so this walks you through our fund balance over time. And so we started the fiscal year with a little under $40 million of available fund balance. Our deficit in that middle column for the current year is estimated at 4.6 million. So we'd end up the fiscal year 19, the current fiscal year, with a fund balance of 35 million, which is a 7.5% of expenditures, which is just a shade under the board's policy of 8 to 10%. But in this scenario, with a deficit of 9.44 million, assuming no changes by the board, and of course there would be between now and June, but based on current revenue assumptions, current expense assumptions, we would outspend our resources by 9.4 million and end up with an ending fund balance of 25.5 million, or 5.3%.
Madam President, Mayor?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you, guys. What's that amount, Mark, when you can get that fiscal letter, that financial letter? What's?
Yeah, once your actual ending fund balance falls below 4% of expenses, you are eligible to be placed on fiscal watch by the state.
Thank you.
And there are no direct consequences of that, but there are indirect consequences because, of course, that relates to our bond ratings and the cost for us to borrow money, which we will continue to do as a part of our construction program. Are there other questions on this chart? And this is, again, work in progress. And I can't do the math in my head. Is the 2.57% increase in total uses, is that on the 18-19 adjusted budget or the 18-19 estimated?
I think it's on the adjusted budget.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the fact that we saved money is a good thing, and we're not increasing the budget even. I don't know what the urban CPI is now. Do you guys know what the urban CPI increase is for this year?
For the calendar year 2018, it was 2.4%.
From calendar 2018 to
Compared
2019?
No, to 2018 compared to
7.
2017.
Okay. So what's the projected for 2019 over 2018? Do we know that?
I think, it'd be between 2 and 3%.
Yeah. Anyway, we're in the ballpark of what would be expected just as normal inflationary increases.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Please go ahead. Thanks, Sam. Thank you.
So I wanted to now get into some other scenarios based on current information that we know about. First one is this charter school equity adjustment. This might be new to a lot of you, but why do we have this? Why are we talking about it? Several bienniums ago, there was a bill passed that said we need to review the equity allocation model. The equity allocation model is really called the Nevada plan. It's a model that takes the statewide per pupil funding, plugs it into a series of calculations that give every district in Nevada a unique per pupil amount. So we have 17 districts. Every district, based on that statewide amount, would receive a different amount than that statewide amount. And over the years, the model gets a little old, and we've had to go in and look at it and say, well, what can we do to make it better and more fit to what's happening in reality? 2 bienniums ago, there were some leftover questions about how to handle charter schools in this model. So we have a working group. It's representative of all the districts pretty much, Charter School Authority, Department of Education, LCB, and the State Budget Office. And the committee meets and talks about issues. And then comes up with recommendations to revise the model. Those recommendations have to go to the Legislative Committee on Education. And the LCE looks at the recommendations. They can make their own recommendations or reviews the recommendations. And whatever they recommend goes back to the state superintendent. Now, the state superintendent can take those recommendations and ultimately has to submit a model to the governor and the Legislative Council Bureau. So that's the reason why this is happening, because in the background we have a law that says we have to review this model. So with the charter schools, in the early days, there weren't that many charter schools, so the model never really addressed it. Last time we met 2 bienniums ago, it was like there's a big chunk of expenditures missing. So it's like, wow, charter schools have really gotten big. They're a significant portion of the statewide budget. So how do we incorporate that in this model? And we came up with several scenarios, and based on everybody's thoughts, we picked the one that we felt worked with it best. But anytime you make any type of change to the equity allocation model, you end up with winners and losers, okay? Sometimes it's pretty even. It's not that big a deal. Somebody's going to gain a few per pupil dollars. Somebody might lose some. But in this case, it had a pretty significant impact across the board for all the districts.
Mike, just if I could clarify or expand on that a bit. So a student from our district who's zoned for our district who attends a charter school, we lose the per pupil revenue from not having that student in our classes, and then we will have an adjustment for the district-wide per pupil revenue potentially from this equity allocation model.
Yeah, inside our actual payments that we get from the state is where all that occurs. Mm-hmm. Right now, charter schools receive the same funding as the district, the county that they're housed in. So any charter schools located in Washoe receive our per pupil funding first. So if a kid leaves our school and goes to a charter school, we not only lose the per pupil funding, we also lose about $1,400 in other local revenue. So pretty much all our funding, if we get $7,000 a kid, we lose that by a kid going to a charter school. Mm-hmm. And not that that's bad, just those are the implications overall. Mm-hmm. So what happened was this kind of chart sort of summarizes all the big changes that really happened. You can see there's decreases, there's increases, and there's big changes across all the districts. 9 districts actually would lose funding. Our per pupil amount actually goes down from the prior year. Lots of districts actually go down, some go up. So when this happens, it's pretty tough to deal with in 1 year in your budget. So the group recommended that we do a phase-in for this adjustment. And this is something that had been done in the past. Years ago, when we sat down and changed the model, there were huge impacts. We said we're going to phase that in over 4 years. So a phase-in recommendation actually went to the Legislative Committee on Education. But it kind of went at a late time. They have a bill now to say, hey, we need the stuff earlier. So they didn't really have time to review or provide any recommendations. So it goes back to the state superintendent, and there was turnover there, as you know. So the current draft model that we have does not include any type of phase-in. And therefore, you get all these big revenue per pupil changes. So what we're doing right now is trying to work with the governor and legislature to say we need to do something about this because it's a huge impact and it's really hard for districts to incorporate this inside of their budget in 1 year. It's easier to do it over a period of time. So what does this amount to right now in our budget? As we talked about before, the statewide amount went up 1.42%, so we assume that percent increase for our per pupil funding in this budget. Given the draft equity allocation model right now without the phase-in, that amount would be $58.66 or $58 less per pupil. And when you multiply it by what the budgeted enrollment is, it's almost $3.7 million. So this is a big outstanding item that needs to be addressed moving forward.
Yes, go ahead, Dr. Taylor.
Thank you, Madam President. Mike, so can you just walk us through, I know that when a child leaves the Washoe County School District school and goes to a charter school, that funding goes with them. So this is in addition to that funding?
Oh, this is inside the Nevada plan, the way charter students were placed inside all these calculations. It was really inequitable. The plan really, when you're inside this plan, it's really saying, what are your costs as a district? And it used to take your costs for your district, not including any charter school costs, and divided it by our enrollment plus the charter enrollment. So it's diluting our per pupil amount when it does that. So we said, well, how do we fix that? And we came up with a way. But anyway, it results in what you're seeing up there on that last slide. Everybody changes, and there's some big impacts to different districts. So that's where that happens. What I believe you're talking about is when we actually receive our funding. So the Nevada plan, the equity allocation model says we get this much per pupil. So they're just multiplying our ADE by our per pupil amount, saying this is how much you should get, divide it by 12 months, they're going to give you a monthly amount. Now, they don't actually give us that whole amount, though. They say, oh, you have some charter school kids, and they are entitled to a portion of your other local revenues. So that would be a portion of our 1/3 or 2/3 ad valorem tax, a portion of our government support, or governmental, GSD, and some other local revenue. And that's almost about $1,400 a kid. So they multiply that $1,400 times the number of charter school students, and that gets deducted from the amount that we receive on a monthly basis. Hopefully, sorry, that's pretty complicated, but
Actually, you kind of followed each other. I'm not sure if that's good or bad, but thank you.
Go ahead.
So I'm going to cover kind of tentative budget version 2.0, if you will. And this was a scenario in which we did include funding for a 3% COLA. So I think as most of you have heard, the governor inserted funding for a 3% COLA. And it's his desire, and I think it's the board's desire to, if there is adequate funding, to provide a 3% COLA. So we modeled that in this 2.0 version of the tentative budget. What we are faced with a bit is the state's base budget does not adequately fund the increases we've talked about. So it's not necessarily an issue with the 3% COLA, but the base budget of the state. And there have been plenty of discussions on it, but we have to model based on what we know today.
Mark, can I just add some
Yes.
commentary for
Yes.
the rest of the board? We met with the governor last week, as many of you are aware, and Trustee Taylor and I, because we thought Vice President Raymond was out of town, but she skated on that one. But we met along with Superintendent Davis and Mark with the governor's office. The governor is very determined that there will be a 3% cost of living adjustment, and is very certain and very confident that the funding, the full funding for that cost, has been included in the state's budget. What we and other districts have identified and tried to share with the state is that we're certain and confident that, and appreciative that the governor put the 3% in the distributive school account, but the way the formula works, we're still only getting 1.42% increase in our per pupil revenue. So we're in a very difficult situation. We absolutely are being supportive and collaborative, but I just wanted to give everybody that tone that it is not negotiable with the state, that the governor wants that money to be reflected in our budget. So as a result of that, Mark and Mike and Jeff and the staff have gone back and recalculated. So just so you're all aware, we're assuming that we will somehow be making that happen, and it does have significant impacts on our budget. So just wanted to share that with everybody. Yes, Trustee Cotto.
Is he intending to make sure it's funded for both years?
That's not what we understand. And he also reminded us that he very generously provided the $8 million that we were due from the reconciliation from the prior budget, but that's not a done deal either. So we are working to be collaborative and cooperative and also fiscally responsible, which is a big challenge given the math that we're working with. So I just wanted to share that as a going in.
Yes. So under a 3% COLA scenario, our total salaries would increase $20.4 million. And we've already talked about the fact that our revenues are only increasing $11.4 million. So that difference is $9 million. In addition, there's a disagreement about health insurance costs. We have actually seen actual health insurance costs over the last 5 years increase on average 8%. And based on discussions with our insurance consultant, budgeted an increase of 10%. And you'll recall in the current year, the insurance consultant had recommended a rate increase of 12, and we adopted 10. So we feel like a 10% rate assumption is reasonable. It's based on experts' recommendations and actual cost trends. However, the state, partly because they get to benefit from the fact that half of their employees are in Southern Nevada, and Southern Nevada health insurance rates are generally cheaper than Northern Nevada, they have only assumed a 3.7% increase in their health insurance costs, and that's what they passed on to school districts. So we have a disparity there that results in a shortfall for us of $2.4 million. And so adding all these numbers up very quickly, in that version 2.0 of the tentative budget in the top half of this slide, you can see that our challenge, our number that we need to reach to balance the budget, is just shy of $18 million. It's that $17.76 million number. In a very worst case scenario in which we face that along with the very technical issue Mike just went through about the charter school equity allocation model adjustment and lost $3.7 million, we would need to find funding for $21.5 million. I'm very hopeful that that worst case scenario doesn't happen. It was one of the points we covered with the governor on Thursday. It seemed as if the budget director of the state was supportive of phasing that in, or maybe not even executing on that adjustment, since we are talking about a new Nevada funding model for the next biennium. So we will see how that goes. So what we would think would be a reasonable tentative budget to submit to the state would assume the 3% COLA, but not that $3.69 million shortfall based on that very technical issue. And there are, again, many districts that are really hurting because of that equity allocation adjustment. We've talked to those districts, and they are in very similar, if not worse positions than us. So we hope that gets resolved. This slide gives you, again, a summary of sources and uses in that scenario. And so, again, we have estimated we would start fiscal year 20 with a opening fund balance of exactly $35 million. If this board did nothing, and I know that's not going to happen, but if we did nothing from this point forward and submitted a final budget with those costs and revenue assumptions as they are today, we would again have a gap of $17.76 million, and we would end up with a ending fund balance for fiscal year 20 of $17.24 million, or 3.5%. And so, as we've talked about, there are really dire consequences of falling below 4%. Certainly the rating agencies, I think, would take action if we submitted a budget like this. And as we talked about in March, there's a real cash flow issue. Our payroll is above $20 million. And we, again, have to make payroll before we receive funding from the state at the end of the month. So there are really significant consequences if we were to go there, and I know that's none of our intentions, but we wanted to show you where how the numbers line up currently.
Mark, is there any relief that can be gotten from an advance from the county on our property tax distribution?
There is. And we ask for that. So every year we do ask for an advance of our property taxes. We get that first property tax distribution that normally comes to us in September about 2 weeks before. So it provides some relief, but what would happen in this scenario is every month we would have a cash flow crunch in that payroll might be, and this is just certified payroll, and related federal taxes are in the neighborhood of $23 million. If we start off the month with a fund balance of 17, we're $6 million short. That doesn't include if the scenario in which classified payroll also falls in that period between the first half of the month and the last half of the month when we get our funding. So this would be a real problem for the district and our personnel, and so we don't want to be here. And we will provide you with solutions so that we're not here. But again, we wanted to share the numbers and the amount of the challenge we face as we head into May and June.
Mark, what's the amount needed, again, I can't do it in my head, what's the amount of dollars needed to get us above 4% for the ending fund balance?
Oh, gosh.
And do we have any opportunity to cut some big costs between now and the end of the year out of the general fund to?
Yeah.
I know you've gone through and identified every single thing. Is there any hope there?
Yeah, so to get above 4% would require roughly $2.5 million.
Okay.
We kind of segueing into kind of where do we go from here?
Okay, sorry, I jumped
No,
ahead.
that's a good segue.
And Trustee Kelly has a question.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam President. And it's on that ending fund balance, the 4%. I know the legislature in the past has lowered, like I think at one point it was 7%, and Senator Debbie Smith had a bill that passed that lowered it maybe to the 4% that we're in now. Is there anything happening in this legislative session that you know that would lower it even further, or do you think that 4% is about as low as we'll ever see it?
You know, I have not seen any bills that adjusted that de facto minimum fund balance. You know, honestly, 4% is half a month's expenditures or revenues. So I have not seen a bill that would do that, even if there were to be a bill to do that, say to lower to 3 or 2.5, and that might happen given other school districts' issues. We'd still have, a huge cash flow issue to confront. We would be downgraded by the rating agencies. All those other things would still happen, but yeah, we in that scenario we would avoid fiscal watch.
Thank you. Okay.
So I know that's not pleasant news. So where do we go from here? As President Simon Holland mentioned, we did meet with the governor. We had a number of requests for the governor, some of which I think were received okay, and some were kind of non-starters. But the request that we did ask about, that I'll go through here, the first one was to suspend our minimum maintenance of effort obligation for purchase of textbooks. And so we budget roughly $6 million for textbooks in the general fund. It's not something we really want to touch. And in fact, we are working on a plan that I'll come back to you in May to find an alternative funding source for textbooks. So this may be moot if we can develop an alternative method to fund those textbooks. But in the meantime, we asked for legislation that would waive that minimum amount. So whether that way we might spend $4 million or $5 million out of the general fund for textbooks and wouldn't be in a problem. So that's one request we made for the governor that would provide relief in our budget, up to $6 million potentially. We talked about class size increases. We know the board doesn't want to go there. Certainly the governor doesn't want to go there. That was not received well, but that was on our list of requests. We did ask for suspension of that charter school equity allocation model adjustment that Mike went through. So again, we hope that that resonates and there's a bill submitted to provide relief, and that if that doesn't happen, our deficit worsens by the $3.7 million. If a bill happens, then we don't have to worry about that. The fourth request we made of the governor was to look at categorical funding and consider moving categorical funding into the general fund. The intention would be we'd still meet all the requirements in terms of personnel that we devote to those programs. But there are some efficiencies that can be generated by those monies coming into the general fund. So we asked about that and didn't get a no on that. So that is something we've asked about. There's actually a bill that's already been submitted by the Speaker of the Assembly that seems to do that. And this is where the new Nevada funding model seems to be going as well. So rather than categorical funding, there would be different weights given for funding for at-risk students. And so this is kind of anticipatory of that, but it would help us.
And Mark, if I could just add for context, the governor was very appreciative that we came in with some proposed solutions. I don't think he was expecting that conversation, and he seemed to be very receptive that we had actually, and thank you, Mark, and the team for thinking of some things that might help, some requests that we could make. So.
Yeah, I thought it was a good working kind of meeting, good dialogue back and forth.
Eventually.
Eventually.
It was a little brutal.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
And then our last request was to ask the governor to consider pledging any additional revenues generated or identified by the Economic Forum in May. And just for those of you who haven't, not familiar with this process, there is a body called the Economic Forum that statutorily is charged with developing revenue estimates. And the legislature and governor are held to those revenue estimates. So they can't budget any more than what the Economic Forum has forecasted. They do their first forecast in December. And so the legislature and the governor prepare their budget based on that forecast. Then they come back by May 10th with updated revenue numbers. And so typically the state waits to see what those revised numbers are in May before they really get serious about kind of fine-tuning the final budget. So we did ask for a pledge that K through 12 would receive any additional revenues identified by the Economic Forum. Certainly didn't get a commitment on that.
That was not received as well as our other suggestions.
You didn't get a commitment.
Yes, yeah.
That's a true statement. A true statement. We did not get a commitment on that. But we did point out that a third of the state's budget goes to K through 12, so any additional revenues, we would at least look for our share. So we'll see. I think we need to prepare our budget assuming we don't get any of that money. But we did ask for it. So again, I think eventually it was a productive meeting. We did not get a commitment on any of these items, but I think there was a receptiveness to a number of these items that would provide relief to our budget. And so we will work with the governor and staff and legislative leadership to try to push those items that were favorably received along, and that will help our budget situation if that happens by the end of the session.
And Mark, I know all of us often get asked about the marijuana money. I know there have been bills to fix or to change where that money is going. Has any of that been built into our projected revenues, and what can you all tell us about that?
No,
Mike is smiling. Yeah.
To answer, none of
Or
those.
smirking. I don't know. It wasn't exactly a smile.
Smirking.
It was a grimace, maybe.
Right. I mean, it's a great idea. Unfortunately, right now, so what we have heard is that, currently the retail tax on marijuana goes to the state's rainy day fund. And I think there's acknowledgement, given where that rainy day fund will end up in the current biennium, it will be healthy. So I think there's an acknowledgement by the state that can stop. Mm-hmm. Currently, I believe the proposals are to use a portion of those retail marijuana tax monies for school safety programs. Mm-hmm. And so that's, as far as I know, where we kind of stand. I haven't heard any bill that would divert marijuana tax money to K through 12's base budgets. But if I'm wrong, anyone can speak up. But
No, you're right. The school safety, that's why the governor had the original task force, and that's where that money is for, more resource officers, mental illness, counselors, social workers, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
So, it is important, it's critical that we work with the state on some of those ideas We have half the session left to do it, so I know Lindsay's fully clued in and teed up on these ideas, and we'll pursue them. For today, then, in lieu of that, and in addition to that, we did ask departments to be ready to present those other scenarios that we talked about in March. We talked about 5 to 10%, and then 20% was mentioned probably by us, but we did ask departments to also look at 20%. So these are the departments that where we didn't make priority-based budgeting cuts before that were kind of held up, and so you will hear from a number of our LT in terms of what those reduction scenarios would look like. And so we will come back in May, and then possibly after session is over in June, depending on legislative changes, with further analysis, further solutions for you to reduce that gap. Most of you are familiar with, we also have a request for proposal for health insurance, so we need to hear how that kind of turns out. That'll factor into the budget as well. So taking all those things together, we will come back to you in May, and again, we may actually take advantage of the state law that lets us adjust our budget in June with ideas and solutions to bring that $18 million number significantly down.
Well, as we get into this, I believe I can speak for the board. I know we all are getting questions about, well, why not this versus that, and why not this expenditure versus that expenditure to be reduced? And I want to be able, just as one trustee, I want to be able to tell everyone that, you know, we're not just looking at what the board requested us to look at, but that you all who are so close to this budget can confirm for us that every expenditure that we end up with in this budget is a necessary expenditure for us to make for the good of the district, and that there are always going to be priorities and rankings and perceptions about, you know, this should have been funded versus that. But from where you all sit as a leadership team, I want us all to be on record that you will be proposing to us those things that you think are absolutely necessary expenditures for us to have going forward.
Absolutely.
Okay, all right, we're on the record. Ugh.
So this goes back to your statement, President Holland. Some of the things you guys wanted, as a board, wanted us to look at, and we've gone through a number of these at previous board meetings, and today we were going to talk about the athletic transportation fees that were brought up. And today, Jeff Bozzo is going to walk you through what we come up with.
Thanks, Mike. President Simon Holland, Superintendent Davis, members of the board. For the record, Jeff Balzo, you had asked us to look into current transportation athletic fees and potential cost recovery increases, which would come through increased fees. So that's what we did. The period of review we used was school year 2017-18, and we used the direct labor costs, which were $785,000. We use these costs because we can track them by timesheets and what those drivers were. They were actually spending time doing athletic transportation trips. We didn't use fuel maintenance, parts, or other costs because we couldn't directly tie those to athletic transportation. Before we get further into the analysis, one concern that the board had was equity in the charges. So currently the way it works right now is that if a student is unable to pay the athletic transportation fee, they don't pay the athletic transportation fee, so that process would stay in place even if we choose to increase the fees.
How's that determined?
I believe that's determined at the school level.
Okay.
So moving on to the next slide, the way we currently have the fee recovery system set up is that each student athlete pays one time for the school year, no matter how many sports they play. So for middle school, the fee is $5 for the year, and at the high school level, the fee is $35. And currently, we recover 26% of our costs using that method. This first slide here looks at what a 50% cost recovery would be for both the middle school and high school level. So if you look at the table on the left, that's using the current practice of charging the student athlete one time per year. So that would increase the middle school fee to $8 and the high school fee to $68 per student. The table on the right shows for high school, if we were to charge the student athlete per sport that they participated in, the total increase would, or the total fee would be $53 to get to a 50% recovery level. Moving on to the next slide, it shows a 75% recovery level. Again, these tables are set up the same way. So for 75%, and just on a per athlete basis, the middle school fees would increase to $12 per student and $102 per high school student. If we were to charge high school students per sport played, the fee would increase to $80.
Vice President Raymond?
So how many students are participating in more than one sport? Is that the 6,678 minus the 5,000? So like 1,000 students?
That would be correct.
1,100.
Yes.
Do you know of those, how many are participating in more than 2 sports?
I can find that out for you. I have the details that we use for the analysis, but I don't
Okay.
have it here with me right now.
Thank you.
So the last slide here is looking at a 100% cost recovery. Again, per athlete for middle school it would be $16 and $137 for high school athlete. And if we charge per sport played for high school, that fee would be $107 per sport played.
I assume there are differences in the transportation requirements among sports too, but that may be an incorrect assumption.
I think there could be, but we'd have to look at or do another analysis and
That
weight
would
those
be,
accordingly.
yeah, really drilling down. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
So those are the options for cost recovery, or 3 options just to give you an idea of how much those would cost, how much per student what the fee would increase, and what the total revenue increase for cost recovery would be.
And I see Mr. Stallworth is here. Rollins, would you like to speak to the board about athletic transportation?
Yes, one of the.
I know I caught you off guard there.
I'm sorry. Yes, you did. I'm sorry. Thank you. Thank you. Rollins Starr, the coordinator of activities and athletics for the district. The issue we have with the transportation fees is collecting those fees, and that's become a big issue in terms of the schools and students and parents paying those fees and then turning those in. With these numbers, there's an assumption there that all of those fees would be collected and we would get that percentage that they're saying with those increases. We don't know the exact amount, and we could probably get that to you with regards to over the last 2 or 3 years, the amount of those fees that have been collected based on the actual funds that were turned into the district as compared to how much should have been turned in. There's a little discrepancy there between those two, and I think we as a district need to clean that process up to make sure that of the current funds that we are currently receiving, we need to make sure that those are being collected to the best of their abilities. Right now, we leave that up to the individual schools to determine who can't pay and who should pay. And I think that's where we're having a little bit of a problem with that as far as the current collection of the $5 transportation fees we're currently receiving.
Okay. Vice President Raymond?
Does that help answer?
Yeah. Yep.
I think you did just answer the question I was about to ask then. So for the high school athletes, we don't know exactly how many athletes are unable to pay the $35 fee based on.
There's an array
no
of reasons.
Tracking of that and why they aren't paying.
We're trying to get the schools to do a better job of tracking that. But basically, basically the schools can't ask why you can't pay. The kid says they can't pay. They just, they can't pay. But, a lot of factors go into that. And again, that's based on individual schools. So if we go to pay, a kid says they can't pay, we just leave it at that and move on.
Dr. Taylor?
Yes, I was just going to say that as a related side note, Rollins was just elected chair of the state NIAA commission, committee.
Yeah, just the board.
The board. I'm new to it, so I'm not quite sure what we're called. But it was fantastic for him to have that kind of support. So thank you for that. Mm-hmm.
Congratulations. Did you have another, Vice President?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I feel like this was presented to us at some point, but how do we compare to other districts in our fees?
So we did reach out to other school districts. Our understanding is Clark County school district does charge athletic transportation fees, but we have not heard back from them about what level they do charge. We did reach out to other school districts in Nevada. They do not charge for athletic transportation fees, at least of the districts we surveyed, which were the neighboring school districts. However, there are many school districts throughout the nation that do charge for this. So we wouldn't be the only school district in the nation that charges. So that's the context we can give you today. And I did want to clarify here that when we look at the current level of fee recovery, these are actual dollars. So we actually do get $205,000 in revenues that offset that $785,000 direct cost. And what the analysis assumes is kind of that kids pay at the same rate they pay now. So we didn't assume anyone who's now not paying that fee would all of a sudden pay the fee. We're just looking at those who can pay. If we raised the fees, what would that produce in terms of additional revenue?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yep, Superintendent.
Rollins, I can't remember this, but is the transportation fee outside of the Spirit Pack? Like, you know how there's all these fees?
Yes.
I can't remember this. So is it built into the total package, or is it separate?
It's built into the total package. So for a kid to participate in sports right now, the way the process works is a freshman come in, they will pay a $35 transportation fee, they will pay a $5 impact fee, and then there'll be a $10 fee for the equipment room and training room facilities fee. So those right now, that's the fee that they would have to pay. That does not include Spirit Pack and other stuff. Those are just the basic payments that a freshman kid would say come in and pay as a freshman coming in playing sports at the high school level.
So do they opt out of all of it? Like, I can't pay. I'm just trying to figure out process in my head. Or do they opt out of just transportation, but I can pay the gym $5? How does that work?
They would possibly try to opt out of all of those. What our office states is that because the impact fee is an insurance policy regarding the concussion and the medical issue of our students, that's when they cannot opt out of paying. So our office makes sure that every kid that is participating in sports in our district has paid the $5 impact fee. So that's the insurance policy. They can't opt out of the other two payments, the $10 training room fee and the other fee for the transportation.
And I'm assuming, are there other fees that they have to pay as athletes that?
If you're an athlete of a particular team, that you will probably pay some kind of a fee for their Spirit Pack equipment, those kinds of things.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
And
Practice gear.
do we provide transportation and charge for transportation for students that are competing in music and future farmers and all those other things?
Their programs will usually pay for them themselves. I know that in our budget, I have a budget that takes student council, student leadership, speech and debate. We have a budget in our account that takes those kids to their state and regional meets, and we pay for them to go. They will pay a $35 transportation fee as well when they are participating in those and provide us that as well.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So it is equitable in that regard. Okay. Other questions, Trustee Cotto? sorry.
Thank you. So the slide that we're looking at, are these just athletes or are these students that are involved in an activity that would pay a transportation fee?
Those are just athletes. They're separate.
Okay,
They're
so
separated.
I would assume, I want to speak for everybody else, that we would be looking to this kind of an increase for across the board, activities, athletics, debate. So it would be both, right?
It should be.
Okay, so this is going to be more than just 5,200 at the high school level, 4,500 at the middle school level. It could be a lot more depending on how many are activities. Correct?
Correct, but that cost would also go up as well based on the fact that
Right.
we're not adding those costs right now into that total cost for the
Okay.
high school level too. That cost would go up.
And a follow-up question: if a student is both an athlete and in debate, are they going to pay the fee twice? Do they currently pay the fee twice?
Currently, they are.
Okay, that's something that we might want to remember too. Thank you.
Dr. Taylor?
Thank you, Madam President. Just as a follow-up, do they pay the same fee now?
They
Middle
pay the
school,
same-
$5 and $35 for high school? Now, the other activities, debate,
No, they
student
don't do
council?
they don't do the impact testing fee, and they don't do the other $10 fee. They just pay
Right.
the transportation.
But the transportation fee is the same, I guess is what I'm
Yes,
asking.
it's the same. It's $35.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Okay, okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Stallworth, and again, congratulations, I think. That was very nice that you stepped up to be the chair of the board for the NIAA. I know that did you? Oh, no, you're fine, okay. I know that staff is looking for direction. Are you anticipating that you'd like to have direction from us on each thing as you go through, or can we hold those conversations till we've heard?
You can hold back on them.
But you'll remind us of
Yes,
those
we will.
things that we need to take action on. Do board members have any appetite at this point, or any sense of how you feel about this? Vice President Raymond?
I just would say I am concerned about the number of athletes that participate in more than one sport and how that would impact them disproportionately. I'm feeling a little more comfortable looking at the per athlete fee versus the per sport played fee. I think even though the per sport, in some cases, that number is less. If an athlete was having to pay $100, $107, 2 or 3 times, I'd worry that would impact their desire and ability to play in more than one sport.
Trustee Caudill?
Yeah, I'm going to piggyback off of that, and with the students that are in athletics and in an activity, and how many students are doing both. Is there almost like a package we want to offer that student? Because I don't want a student to have to choose. Do I stay on the basketball team or do I stay in debate? And my fear is that on more times than not, the athletics portion of that's going to win out, and then our participation in the activities would go down solely based on a financial decision. So that might be something we want to look at, so to try to do what we got to do with the budget, but also not force students to make a choice.
I think that's well said, and we certainly have a commitment in our strategic plan to educating the whole child, and we have heard a lot of research and presentations about the importance of well-rounded students that do participate in a variety of activities. That is one of the things that keeps kids in school to graduation is having the opportunity to be in those activities. Just as one trustee, I'm not anxious to move to 100% cost recovery. I do think that it's okay to increase that cost somewhat, but I wouldn't want to go that far. And I think I'm sensitive, as others are, to the comments that Trustee Caudill has made. I'm not sure who was first over here.
Go right ahead.
Trustee Kelly?
Thank you, Madam President. Yeah, I know as a board, we've directed staff in the past to be a little bit more aggressive in recovering nutrition fees. Students that aren't paying, well, parents of students that aren't paying, and I think that that model should somewhat apply to this model, in that yeah, 100% recovery I think is just unrealistic, but 26% to me seems like that's far too low, that there might be parents that, or students or whatever, that are, avoiding paying because they can. And so I would definitely be interested in seeing what can staff do to, being sensitive, of course, but what can we do to increase the percentage that students are paying these fees, especially since we're in a budget crisis. That's something that we need to look at. And I think that our approach to nutrition maybe could be a model for how we would approach this. You're making it easier for people to pay online, sending out reminders, things like that.
Trustee Dr. Taylor?
Thank you, Madam President. Just two comments. One, as was mentioned before, I certainly think we want to be mindful, from a financial equity standpoint. If an increasing cost there could potentially be a situation where a child that could pay now can no longer pay. There's always that balance there, and of course we know that will happen some. We're also dancing that fine line from a budgetary standpoint. I concur. I think going to 100% is a lot. I don't know if there's much appetite for that. It's probably time for an adjustment. I would say in looking at the 50% recovery, the jump from $35 to $68 is a large increase. And so my thinking, since we're just kind of sharing how we think about these things right now, is I would look for, is there another way to make up some of the finances, but consider, that's almost a 100% increase, and to consider the impact from that standpoint as well. Thank you.
Okay. Any other comments? Okay. Well, let's move forward then. And again, thank you, staff, for looking at that. I know these are all very difficult decisions for everybody, trying to balance the fiscal responsibility with the impacts on individual kids and families. So thank you for working on it.
Okay.
One more question on that before we go. Are there legitimate ways for students to provide work in service to offset some of their costs of participation? I don't know what do you want to speak, Mr. Stallworth? Yeah, please.
Roland Stallworth, the Director of Activities and Athletics for the district. Madam President and the board, a lot of the athletic programs have ways and means for the kids to pay a lot of their fees. A lot of schools, especially for their Spirit Pack fee, so they kind of try to take that fee away from the parents and have the parents pay for, say, the fees that we just talked about, and then they set up other programs that they can do in terms of working. They do car washes, they do other fundraising things, they sell little cards, they do a lot of those things to help offset the cost of the Spirit Pack. So a lot of the schools do have programs for that. I don't know if the schools have specifically been having programs set up to cover these particular costs, those requirements, say, to go out, but I know that they have, most of the schools, if not all, have athletic programs that do that. I know my son is currently on the McQueen baseball team, and we could go and buy an ad that went into the outfield as a family, and that paid for a Spirit Pack. And so instead of paying X out for the Spirit Pack, we just paid for that sign, and that covered the cost of the Spirit Pack. So most of the schools and athletic programs have those kind of programs, along with the clubs and activities and speech and debate. They have programs that help pay for their $35 fees and those kinds of things as well. So they are out there. I think one of the things that we need to do as a district is make sure that everyone's kind of exposing that for everyone to do it, instead of kind of keeping it quiet and oh, this is where we can do it, but we're not going to let anybody else know, kind of a thing. But they're doing it out there.
Good. Okay. And I think there's some positive ways to do that. Obviously, it's a slippery slope because there are some schools and parent groups that can raise more money than others. But it is, I think it's always an opportunity, carefully implemented, to have kids and families participate in how can we help. So, okay, great, thank you. Sorry, I cut you off there, Mike.
No problem. So at our last meeting, the board directed us to kind of reduce the amount of reductions instead of looking at 100% of quartile 4 and 50% of quartile 3 programs, to kind of get a better grasp and feel for what the reductions look like. You asked for a lower percentage range. So we developed a 5, 10, 20% range, and it was only for those departments that weren't on the list for reductions that we presented at the last meeting. The intent is for each department to come up. I think Office of School Leadership, their original reduction, all they could really do was a administrative secretary, and it's hard to cut a portion of a secretary. So what they came up with is their operating budgets, basically reducing 5, 10, 20%, and the amounts would be $2,800, $5,600, and a little over $11,000. I don't know if you want to expand on that anymore.
Can we just hear from someone on staff as to what the impacts of that would be? Just examples of what the consequences and impacts would be.
Good morning, Superintendent Davis, President Holland, members of the board. Kristen McNeil, Deputy Superintendent. So our area superintendents for each one of their schools, so keep in mind that each one of our area superintendents has about 23 to 25 schools that they oversee. They use their operating budget for a variety of supports for their schools, whether it's paying for a long-term substitute, whether it's paying for professional development, whether it's paying for a principal type meeting, but very focused on the individual school. So there's a lot of different types of scenarios where the area superintendents will provide support. So what you're seeing there, just as Mike was saying, as far as the 5%, 10%, 20% reduction, that's going to go directly to schools as far as what that support would look like.
Okay. And we've already reduced one area superintendent position, or?
Right, so we started off about 3 years ago with 7 area superintendents,
Wow.
and we have 4.
Wow. Okay.
And that's including an increase in the number of schools as well.
Right. Okay. All right. Thank you. That's helpful.
So next up on the list was the area of the chief of police.
He's here.
Mr. Trevino will talk to you about that a little bit. This one's a little bit complicated as to try to generate some savings.
Good morning, President Simon Holland and board members and Superintendent Davis. So we looked at this a ton of different ways. Mike and I had some long conversations about it. So real quick, the easiest one is the victim advocate. It's one FTE, it's one person in one position. So there's really no way to put 5, 10, 15, 20% cuts on that. It's one FTE. So if we were to reduce that FTE, it would go away. It's not a part-time position or anything like that. We looked at, would it be possible to reduce it to a half-time FTE or something like that, and it just really didn't seem feasible due to the nature of the work. So that one is kind of, it is what it is because it's only one person. If we had 4, 5, 6 people in there, it would be a little bit better to work with. The one that gets a little complicated is the overtime. Like we talked about before with the overtime, on surface, the $36,279 doesn't seem like a huge piece of the pie that we're looking at, but we do know that there's also a debt liability attached to that dollar amount with the comp time that can be taken for the overtime. So we talked about this in depth, and really what that comes down to is per the officers' contracts, they can bank up to 300 hours of comp time. So when they bank those hours of comp time, it's not going to be reflected in this $36,279. And per their contract, they can cash out their comp time 4 times per year. Each quarter they can cash it out, or they can let that 300 hours ride indefinitely until they retire or cash it out at any given time. Typically, we see the 2 biggest cash out times are right before summer because people are planning vacations and things like that, and then also the one right before our winter break because people are paying for Christmas gifts and those types of things. So where that real debt liability comes from on that overtime is if I earn that at the pay rate I'm making today, and then in July I get a step increase and a cost of living increase, those comp time hours just also got that same increase that I got on my current step. So if I earned it, at whatever, $20 an hour, but then I wait to cash it out until I've received several step increases and I cash out at $28 an hour, obviously it's earning interest on that debt liability. So just to be upfront and open about it, the $36,279 is kind of a little bit misleading when we know for a fact that a lot of people take those hours as comp time. It's not reflected. So with that being said, when we looked at it with the small numbers that were given to try and cut, again, it didn't make a whole lot of sense every which way we looked at it. For instance, like for a Friday night football game for varsity, if we cut one person from that rotation, that's 7.7% roughly. Well, how do you cut one person? How do you decide that tonight Reno High School doesn't get an officer, but every other game gets an officer? And then next week, Galena doesn't get an officer, but Reno gets one. Because inevitably, the way things work in law enforcement is wherever we don't have that officer assigned, that's where we're going to need that officer, right? So in looking at it, we wanted to be respectful of the request and figure out, was there a way that we could propose cuts fairly across the board that would be somewhat palatable without getting rid of it altogether, which obviously is an option as well that we put in there. So when we looked at it, we came up with option one that you'll see. So the freshman and JV games for both football and basketball typically have smaller crowds than varsity games. The two most feasible ways to reduce the overtime while still providing coverage would be to go to a rover system rather than assigned officers at every game. The roving system would basically mean that we'd have a group of officers in patrol that would be out and they would stop in at the various games, check in, find the administrator, see if there's anything going on, touch base with them if everything's fine, make a couple of rounds, and then they would go on to another game. And we'd have them separated so they wouldn't be like a group traveling all to one game. They'd be split up, probably by region, and they would hit the different games within that region. If there was an issue going on in any particular game, then that officer could stay there to make sure everything's going okay. One thing to add with the rover system that's important is all of our area high school, well, every school in the district, but our high schools in particular have multiple radios, and they can contact our dispatch via radio and get that instant response just like our officers get. So if we don't have someone assigned there, we're in a roving status, and they needed an officer to get there, they can call on that radio and get that immediate response. Option number two would be to go to a rover status for all game levels. So rather than just doing the freshman and JV roving, we could rove all the games. So that basically means like on football on Thursday night, you have your freshman and JV games. We would have a group of roving officers out there covering all of those games. And then Friday night for the varsity games, same type of system. We'd have a group of rovers out there for those types of games. Option number three, you could look at eliminating coverage for the freshman and JV games altogether and then go to either a roving status for the varsity games or stay with the current method of assigning officers to those varsity games. So I know the one question that we talked about last time was, how many problems do we have at these games? Is it necessary? The answer is we really can't tell you exactly until we take the officers away, right? So this model's been in place since I started working here back in 2005. We have modified it over the years. We actually have reduced the amount of officers. When I first started working, they had 4 officers at every varsity game, and over the years that's been reduced down to basically 2, unless it's a rivalry game or there's been some sort of an incident leading up to that game, then we will increase the amount of officers. So it has been reduced over the years. We, luckily do not have a lot of big problems at games as a whole, but we do have problems at games. I know Mr. Stallworth's here. We've been working on an issue from football season that's still being dealt with. So they do happen. So I can't say that there's no repercussions if we take them away, but I also can't tell you that it's going to be mass chaos either. We just don't know until we kind of get into that position. But if we went to a rover status, we would still have officers out there. They'd still be hitting the games. They'd still be checking in, responding, and they're available via radio if the schools needed something. Okay. So with that, depending on which models we looked at, which various rover status for varsity, freshmen, or both, it could reduce anywhere from 54% to 72% roughly based on all the different scenarios that I went through. And then the big picture would be that's reducing the amount of hours of people working per night, which therefore reduces the amount of hours that eventually could be that comp time debt liability reduction. So like Mike and I talked about, wouldn't see a big hit or a big impact on the general fund even if we eliminated it this year, you wouldn't see a huge hit. The $36,000 roughly is what you kind of see. But over the course of 2, 3, 4, 5 years, you'd see that reduction in comp time balances, and then that debt liability would obviously be reduced once we stopped adding to the amount of hours worked.
Okay. Superintendent?
Yes. Thank you, Jason. I have a couple questions. I know we talked about this. As a result of eliminating the victim advocate, what services will not be rendered?
Yeah, absolutely. So currently with the victim advocate position, that victim advocate provides victim resources to victims of crime in our district, whether those are adults, meaning our employees, or our students. So she helps them do everything from get temporary protection orders, attend court hearings for them, help them get restitution if they're the victim of a crime. She's the one that puts them in contact with various agencies that can provide funding, that can get them into the system. She provides that paperwork. She walks them through that. She actually works hand in hand with all the other victim advocates and has done some great work. We actually have access now live to the temporary protection order database, which we've never had before. She has access to that. So when we have a question that arises in the field about a paperwork, we don't have to try and have our dispatch on hold with the clerk's office trying to find out if that's active or not active. We can actually go in right then and see if that paperwork's active. So those are the kind of resources that she provides, and it's one person. She works very closely with all the other victim advocates as well. So if we do have, say a domestic violence incident that was, pretty substantial that occurs outside of school hours, and then say the city of Reno's victim advocate is involved, they will contact her and say, hey, just to give you a heads up, we had this incident last night, these were the children involved, so that she can kind of work with that and get a heads up and work with counseling. She works very closely with the counselors through Catherine's office as well.
And I know we asked last year, I know Vice President Raymond and I both asked about, because the other victim advocates in the community are funded from the state grant funding, and I recall the response was that there had not been, either it hadn't been applied for or we hadn't been awarded money for that victim advocate. Is there any update on getting one for the future? Have we applied for the next cycle?
Yeah, I talked to our victim advocate about it, and she was under the impression that was a little bit different, that they weren't all being funded, that there were some that were funded originally through some grants that have been since picked up under general fund budgets from those other agencies when they were started on grants and then had been turned over. So we are researching into that to see if there is grant money available, but the current grants that we typically get through school police the victim advocate does not meet the criteria for.
Okay. Go to Dr. Taylor and then to Vice President Raymond.
Thank you, Madam President. Chief, the number, the 36,279, is that the total amount of overtime per year?
That was a number that Jeff Bozos from Business was able to help me with that was actually paid out in that year.
It's in addition to the comp time and...
Correct. That does not reflect the comp time that's been banked or cashed out. And then that number also, my recollection, and I think Jeff's right there, that was all the overtime, correct?
Correct.
So that's not just the sports. There's the overtime that's unavoidable in law enforcement, right? If we have a missing student call that comes in at 4:20, we don't at 4:30 say, "Oh, we're off shift. We're not going to look for this kid anymore," right? So there's that unavoidable overtime, which we try and keep in check the best we can. But that is also included in that number. So even if we got rid of the sports overtime, we still would have a small amount of overtime that takes place.
Okay, thank you.
Vice President Raymond?
I have two things. So I'm the grants administrator for the Domestic Violence Resource Center, and so I'm very familiar with the grant part of it all. And just from what I know, we have 7 advocates at the Domestic Violence Resource Center, and they're all grant funded. The majority are funded by the Victims of Crime Act through the State of Nevada Department of Child and Family Services. And that grant the application was due about a month and a half ago, and we just received our confirmation of what we were getting 2 weeks ago. So that is for next fiscal year, and so there's no opportunity with that specific grant, I know. And my understanding, because I go to all these meetings, is that the cities and the counties often use VOCA funding for their victim advocates. So I do think it is worth continuing to explore. My understanding was we did apply and we were not awarded the funding, and so there's not much that I could add about why, because I don't know why. But I think the last thing I would say about that part is that I don't like the idea of not having a victim advocate for our district, especially for our size and the kind of work that we're doing. But I know that there is a large network of, advocates in the community, and we're already working with them. So I would hope that if we had to go down that route, that we could look at ways to fill that gap with outside partners, and then hopefully recover the position through grant funding in the future. But I'm not saying that I'm interested in considering that necessarily, but I guess if that is where we had to go, that would be my 2 cents on it. My question is though, I think I got confused. So the 54 to 70% reduction, that's just to the $36,000, or is that to the total $153,000 on that orange bar up there?
Yeah, Jason Trevino for the record. So the orange bar is the victim advocate and the 36,000 combined. The 54 to 72% reduction would be the amount of officers assigned to the game. So then if, let's just say one officer works 3 hours at a football game, then that's 3 hours less of overtime that would be earned for that officer. So by reducing that total officers' work by 54 to 72%, it just would depend on how many hours each officer worked through the football season, and that would be the reduction. And ultimately, the biggest impact would be that comp time reduction on the back end. It wouldn't be a huge front-end payout reduction that we would see. It would be the back end.
And we don't really know what that amount would be. Or is it the 36,000?
No, the 36,000 is the small end. That's the front end. That's what people are taking in pay. And the majority of officers don't take it in pay up front because the benefit of taking it as comp is during the breaks they can take substantial amounts of time off. We work minimum staffing during like summer break, winter break, fall break, spring break. So per their contract, they can only take a certain amount of hours off during the school year because the idea is we want the officers here when the kids are here, which makes total sense. But then the fallback to that is we need to let them take their time off that they've earned during the breaks. So the majority of them will take it as comp and then, like I said, either cash it out periodically, a savings account, if you will, or they'll bank it up and then take extended vacations, things like that. So the long-term reduction would be the amount of comp time being reduced.
Just a couple things on that, and thank you for coming forward with some suggestions. I know those are tough to do, and did some great brainstorming on all this. I want to confirm, Vice President Raymond, you said that your understanding is that the district did apply for grant funding for the victim advocate, and we were not successful. Is that?
I asked about that for the fiscal year we're currently in. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that an application was submitted for next fiscal year.
Do you know, Chief?
I do not. I made a note to check on that. And I know when I talked to Megan, she actually did mention the Domestic Violence Resource Center was funded by the grant. However, she said that the city ones were not. The district did receive some VOCA funding, like through Catherine's office, and Megan Long, our victim advocate, she does work with Catherine on the VOCA money that was received to try and get the appropriate victims put in touch with that and get that resource available to them.
Great.
So we have received some VOCA funding, just not for the position.
Okay.
So I have a point of clarification. The 7 county victim advocates are funded in their general funds, but the one, well, I'm looking at Mark, but the ones you're talking about is a different.
Those are private.
Private. You're talking private.
Yeah,
right? Okay.
nonprofits.
Right.
But I think, and Mark would know better from the county. The county gets, and the cities get massive amounts of funding compared to small nonprofits from VOCA. And we had a position that the county funded using VOCA funds. So there are positions, advocate positions, I think, that fall under the umbrella of the city and the county that are funded by VOCA, is my understanding. But this is, not really.
But
I don't know.
It is an opportunity.
Yes.
And I guess I think, assuming we go forward with continuing to have a victim advocate, I think it would certainly be my request that we make sure that we do everything we can to apply for that for future years, and if we don't get it, we don't get it, but at least we've done what we can to apply for it. I just had another question about on the game staffing. So all of our police officers are post-certified, aren't they?
Correct.
Yeah. So do they have something in their contract that prohibits us from using anybody who's like a security guard or something for that kind of service?
I'll defer that to Virginia's not here, but that was brought up in the past. So several years ago, we looked at potentially trying to start a reserve program where you'd have post-certified officers that would be able to, work some of these events and not get paid. There was at that time a supplanting issue brought up by the association.
Right.
So again, I'd have to defer to legal on that. I don't want to make a guess on that, but I can just say from past experience that was brought up. I did research your previous suggestion on the CERT volunteers, talked to the CERT coordinator. He said there was no way they would possibly ever be able to cover that,
Really?
and they wouldn't cover it without law enforcement officers there anyway, because the CERT officers are not sworn.
Yeah.
They don't have any law enforcement powers. They're just people walking around, eyes and ears more than
Yeah.
anything.
Well, thanks for checking on that.
And then I also did check with the reserve coordinator for the sheriff's office, because they do have a reserve program, and they said there was no way that they could even touch that with the amount of reserves that they have.
Okay. Well, thanks for looking into it. I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Dr. Taylor?
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to get back to something Vice President Raymond said, that there may be an opportunity because of the partnerships that are in the community to have a partnership with them because I think it's important to have someone that's helping victims and working with them and helping them put their lives back together and to stay safe and all those things. I think that's really important. But you mentioned that there may, just because of what you do, there may be an opportunity to partner with some of them during this time as we position ourselves, hopefully, to apply for a grant once again. Can you elaborate just a little bit on that? I mean, what are you thinking? Are you thinking that perhaps if we did not fund this for next year, that we could have adequate coverage? I just wanted to dig into that a little bit. And I know this is just throwing it out there.
I don't know how the chief would feel about that. I just know that there are a lot of advocates in the community, and they're busy, doing that work all the time. But I think the example you gave, they all work together, so there is a lot of crossover, which is important. But I just wonder if there is a way that, through the advocates that are working in the community, that the work that our advocate is doing would be absorbed in some form. I don't know for sure, but I just know that none of them work alone in their kind of bubble. They're all interacting. Our advocates work with the city of Reno and the county and the other nonprofits that have advocates in their offices, so that they can make sure that every victim is receiving that support and care that they need. I think what you see is that the immediate needs are often addressed by the city or the police department, wherever that first incident is, whoever is the first person on scene, and then they often do get kind of moved based on what the actual crime was. So if it was a domestic violence crime, then they do end up at that, at our office or the other offices in town. So I don't know. I didn't have something actually in mind. I just was wondering if the work could be supported by the other advocates in the community, either temporarily or, not at all. I don't know.
Thank you. Okay, any other questions? Yes, Trustee Calvert?
I know Megan, and I've worked with her on a lot of, I used to be on the ABR board, and when she came on, it was very appreciative because she was more geared to me working with kids in the school. So to me, that's something important because she does have that training and that experience, whereas a lot of the other advocates are more geared towards working with adults. So, I mean, like I said, I've known Megan when she first came on ABR, and we are very grateful to have her with us because she was able to reach out to a lot of the kids that are in school and that were having problems and having issues. She was able to address those, where a lot of times if you're an adult, I mean, you're thinking in a totally different mindset as to how to help kids. So, I mean, I don't know if that helped or not, but I just believe that having someone that understands what's going on in the school is quite different than what's going on in our communities. And they do go hand in hand, both of them. But I do believe that it's crucial that we do have someone, because those things do arise. And kids do need to know that they can go to someone. They're not going to pick up the phone and go, well, I need to call CAW because I have a problem with my boyfriend. I mean, that's just not reality. That's not going to happen. But if they know that we have someone in the school district that they can go and talk to, I think that is a lot better for them than calling up and saying, you know, and it's confidential. I mean, she's not going to come out and put their business out in the street. Not that anyone would, but I mean, I just feel that the kids would feel a lot more comfortable with someone that they know, as opposed to someone that is not known to them.
Okay, thank you, Trustee Calvert. Chief, you've been there a while on the hot seat, so thank you. I just personally, as one trustee, I would like to look at option one, where we go to a rover system for the JV. I want to make sure we're doing everything we can to scrub this budget, and though it's a tiny amount of money, again, there's the optics and all of the other things that we're working on. That's just as one trustee, I just wanted to share. But I am so appreciative of the thinking that you've been doing on this, so thank you. Is there anyone else who wants to make any comment on that? And again, it helps the staff if we can give them some input. You know, we're going to have to make these decisions today to file a tentative budget. So, Dr. Taylor?
Well, that being the case, that strong hint, someone say where you're at so staff knows where I got it. I'm going to concur. When I was reviewing this prior, I would be more comfortable with option one as opposed to 2 or 3. I just think too much happens at games. And I'm not that comfortable with 1, frankly.
Right.
So let me go on the record saying that. But in the interest of, we know we need to do something to balance this, and we're looking for a particular number, according to Mark. I just appreciate the opportunity to say what can be done. And certainly it isn't a huge amount of money, but every little bit adds up. And so I appreciate that. An option like that, which I could live with option 1. I'd have a much harder time living with 2 or 3. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Chief.
Okay. I see some heads nodding on that. I think I see a majority of heads nodding on that. So again, we're very grateful, and we're very grateful for those officers who are out there too, because we know they do so many things at those games, just making positive contact, you know, saying hello to kids they recognize, and we know how important that is. So please thank them for us. It has nothing to do with our, you know, any desire to have less presence. We're just trying to look for everything we can. So thank you, Chief. Appreciate that. Do we want to do a motion on that now?
I just think nodding of the heads probably doesn't or put it on a list. Okay, I wasn't sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Do we want to wait?
Well, if we have a motion that we're comfortable with making at this point, I think it would be good to make it.
Okay, so, why don't I change that into the form of a motion, Madam President? I move that the board adopts option 1 for the freshman and JV games of both football and basketball to go to a roving system to cover those games.
For freshmen and JV
yes,
only.
I said that for freshman and JV games.
Okay, is there a second? Second by Trustee Calvert. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Okay, thank you, Chief. Thank you, Trustee Taylor. Okay.
Okay, moving on to Chief Student Support Services Officer and Student Athletics and Activities. I believe Victor Sherbondi is here to address these issues. Thank you, Victor. And Rollins Stallworth.
Good morning, President Simon Holland, Superintendent Davis, trustees. For the record, Victor Sherbondi, Executive Director, Office of Student Services, and Rollins, if you want.
Coordinator of Athletics and Activities, Rollins Stallworth. Thank you, Madam President and the board.
As you can see, we have 3 scenarios for you here. Each one of them, I can say, will have an impact to students and families. However, this is what we are proposing at this time. And the first one is a 5% reduction. It would be a savings of $113,537. And this would essentially cut the cost for any regional and state playoff travel and accommodations for athletes. And under this scenario, Washoe County School District teams that qualify for state or regionals with the new state playoff would no longer participate, or they would have to find some alternative funding sources. And that would be possibly fundraising or donations of some sort to get them to that state competition. Each one of these scenarios is embedded in the next one. So the 10% reduction would be the 5% reduction plus. In addition to the above cut, we would reduce the middle school athletics budget by $61,500. So essentially from $210,000 down to $149,000. And this would be approximately a 30% cut to the middle school athletic program. And we have the rough estimations of exactly what every middle school sport costs. And this would either be approximately one large middle school sport, or two or three smaller middle school sports. And then the third scenario would be the addition of the first and second plus the third would be 20% reduction. In addition to the 5% reduction, this would eliminate the entire middle school athletics budget. And that would be a decrease of about $210,000. And that would eliminate all middle school athletics, in addition to that 5% original. And that would be a savings of $362,134. So Rollins and I are happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Questions, trustees, Mr. Caudill?
Yeah, so for me, I'm good with the increasing of the fees to make up money for athletics, but I don't think any of these three scenarios make me very comfortable, honestly. I think increasing of the fees will make up some of the money, and I think going off of what Trustee Kelly had said and ensuring that we're getting the fees, I think that would be equivalent to a budget cut, because we're taking it out of our budget, but we're keeping our level of service. That's where I am.
Okay. Vice President Raymond?
Yeah, I know we've talked at a lot of our previous meetings about how we've made so many cuts at this point that we're just down to bone, and that's clear with these options. These impact our students just so greatly. I wish that we could have looked at something that was not at that student level, but I'm assuming that the fact that we weren't presented something is because we've already made substantial cuts at other levels that, would at the administrative level or whatever. But I just think these are, not feasible for a lot of reasons. I mean, I think the 5% reduction, I just think we can't eliminate the possibility of our teams going to playoffs. And so even though there is the possibility of donations and fundraising, I just think it's too significant. So.
I agree with that. I can't, I just can't see us eliminating the opportunity for those students who achieve those levels to not have the opportunity to go to regional and state playoffs. I do know that a lot of parents do get involved to help with some of our regional and larger playoffs, and I appreciate that tremendously. I just don't think this is viable either. Anyone else? Trustee Caudill?
So in the 10% reduction, which sports is that going to affect?
Do you want to?
Well, I'm going to start with the coordinator of athletics and activities. To answer that question here, we have a list of what it would cost to eliminate sports. We looked at the possibility of eliminating the non-cutting sports, the cross country, track and field, and wrestling. The problem is that those sports make up about 52% of the middle school sports as far as their participation is concerned.
And talk about the sixth graders too.
Oh, and then the fact that the district is moving towards moving sixth graders up to the middle school level we're still looking for ways to get the sixth graders involved. So as I'm on one committee that's looking at having athletics and participation for the sixth graders who are entering the middle school level. And at the next meeting I'm going to, we're talking about eliminating middle school sports for our 7th and 8th graders. So it's been kind of frustrating aspect of going through this. So when we start talking about eliminating those sports, if we start talking about eliminating the major sports or those cutting sports that the parents are deeply involved and entrenched in, which are basketball, volleyball, and those sports, you're going to have a lot of people in here raising Cain. So with that said, it's very difficult to pinpoint where we could specifically cut a sport or cut an activity for our kids to participate in specifically.
Yes, Vice President Raymond.
And I would just add, I think maybe for some of the newer trustees over the past year or two when we've gone to middle schools and done student discussions, but also when I've joined the superintendent, one of the biggest things that comes up with middle schoolers is their desire to expand athletics and have more longer seasons and more opportunities. Right. And I have heard that at every single middle school meeting conversation I have been to, and I think any cut to the middle school athletics is challenging, because if in a perfect world we'd be looking at expanding all of that. Right.
Well, I'd like to add to that, board member. If we go back several years ago, we did cut 50% of middle school athletics. So middle school athletics schedule and seasons used to last 12 weeks and they played 10 to 12 games. Now they last 8 weeks and play 6 games. So the middle schools have been drastically cut in the past budget issues that the district has had. They've sacrificed 50% of all their games since the last budget cut. So they've been, the sacrifice has already taken place, and we're trying to get that back. What we have developed is there is some inequities in the current process based on the fact that the richer schools get to play a couple of more games, where the schools that don't have extra cash or excess funds only play the 6 that we schedule for them. So some schools are playing 8 to 10 games, while the majority of the schools are just playing 6 games. So we have hit the middle schools hard over the years with budget cuts in the past.
Trustee Cotto?
Yeah, one thing I was just thinking about the fees. With 6th graders moving into middle school, it's going to be more students, potentially more fees collected than have been collected in the past. Is there any way to get a sense on the increase you're going to see in fees collected by just the 6th graders being in middle school when they weren't before? There's going to be more students potentially participating.
Well, we really don't know, because we have not made a decision yet specifically on how the 6th graders are going to participate. Last year at some of the schools, the 6th graders only participated in a practice-only format for non-cutting sports at the current middle schools this past year. So next year, as we increase the amount of 6th graders that are going to the middle school level, at this particular time, that is one proposal on the table, is just to keep it that way. Well, if middle school kids are not going to be able to participate in the activity, but yet just go to practice, I don't think we're going to get a true number of how many kids would go out. And are they making those kids that just go out for practice at the 6th grade level pay the $5 fee, which my guess is that they're probably not, since they're not being transported to and from games using the district transportation a $5 fee. So those are still some issues that we have to address as a district in terms of how we're going to implement the 6th graders into the middle school athletic programs.
Yes, Dr. Taylor.
Thank you, Madam President. Just a couple of things to jump onto what my colleague just said. If there are ways, as you look forward to finding ways for sixth graders to participate, because I think that we would all want greater participation, especially for those students that are, you're in a new environment and it's very different for you and so on, to have a way to connect, you know, with each other and with the school and so on. Maybe keep in mind, if you can, those things that may increase participation without increasing costs. For an example, if they're sharing a bus and those kinds of things, so the fee is still coming in, but the expenses, because if you increase fees, we're increasing expenses, if we increase another bus. So maybe if there are opportunities as you're looking for it to give a chance to maybe, you know, cut down on that deficit a little bit without adding some of the increased costs that, say, adding another sport would do or something. Basketball teams are riding together, you know, for an example. That might be something that, just as you're looking for those opportunities.
Victor Shabandi for the record. Just to comment to that, that's a great idea. And we actually did spend quite a bit of time earlier this school year looking at that. And what the committee came up with is a fairly robust intramural program at the middle schools that would involve more of those sixth grade students and seventh and eighth grade students potentially, but particularly those sixth grade students, to get them to buy in at a very low cost. So we are looking at that, and I think it's a very viable option.
Thank you. If I may, Madam President,
please.
follow up. The other thing is, just as an indication, any one of these, quite frankly, would be difficult for me to support. Just honestly, would be difficult for me to support any of those. And I recognize that there are things that we certainly need to do, but just the value of athletics and the opportunities for participation, and I mean, looking at no middle school sports at all, and not sending kids to state and regional. I mean, those things are just unconscionable for me, quite honestly. So just for where I am, I couldn't imagine cutting those. So.
Okay.
But thank you for the options.
Yes, yeah, thank you for trying to figure some things out, and these are very unfortunate. Okay. I think we also probably have a consensus of opinion about that if we want to take a motion to act on these proposals. Thank you, Dr. Taylor.
I'm your girl. I move that the Board of Trustees does not consider reductions in the student activities and athletics programs as presented.
As presented on slide 36.
On slide
Okay.
36.
All right, great. Okay, second by Trustee Caudill. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Okay, and thank you again for the creative thinking to see what we can do, intramurals or whatever else, to try to keep the cost down for those kids. All right, thanks.
Madam President?
Yes.
Are we going to, as a board, make a decision on the fees today, or are we pushing that to a later date?
I think we'll come back to that.
Okay.
We have it on our list to come back to. So I think we'll try to do that. Okay, let's keep pushing ahead, and I appreciate the board taking action on these as we go.
Okay, we have Mr. Pete Etchart here to talk about facilities management and 20% reductions to that area.
Okay, thank you. And just trustees, we have a lot to do still, so I haven't given us a break yet. Maybe we could go till like 12:30 before we break, but let's keep going as quickly as we can. Yeah. Okay. Welcome, Mr. Etchart.
Thank you. Good morning. Pete Etchart, Chief Operating Officer, and I'm joined by Tammy Zimmerman, our Deputy Facility Management and Capital Projects Officer, and also Charlie Hoppy, our Director of Maintenance and Housekeeping. So to kind of jump right in, under the 5% reduction scenario, the first two items are really kind of, no pun intended, but kind of financial housekeeping. These are things that we would be doing regardless of probably a budget reduction, because this is one of the benefits I think that we're seeing now as we start dealing with the overcrowding issue this district's been facing. So as we're building these new schools and bringing them online, and we have less students at our existing schools, and we start eliminating portables, then we can start kind of shuffling a little bit of our housekeeping and custodial personnel around. So basically at the elementary middle school level, we'd be looking at a reduction, I should say reduction, a moving of some of our personnel. So that's really the first item on the list. So I think that's kind of an easy one for us.
So that's the 176,085.
Correct.
Okay.
And that's basically at the elementary school level, like I said, moving 2.5 positions around, and then one at the middle school. Originally, when we allocated positions for the new middle schools, we were showing 6 custodians each, which was our standard. Now we've gone down to 5.5, so basically we're just cutting one out of the 2 new ones, so that's the reduction in the middle school. So
Okay.
again, kind of just a moving of the pieces. Now it gets a little bit more difficult, so I'm going to turn this over to Tammy Zimmerman to talk about the groundskeeper allocations.
So with our groundskeepers, we have currently at 10 sites, we have 2 groundskeepers, a groundskeeper 1 and a groundskeeper 2, and we would be cutting a half a position at each of those schools and splitting it with the custodial. So you would work half custodial and half groundskeeper for one of them, which with we would reduce the level of service. With our athletics, our fields would not be lined, most likely. Those groundskeepers do a lot of work with our drainage channels, our drainage catch basins, trash removal, light carpentry repairs with bleachers and safety items and that. So we would see a reduction of that kind of service more for our athletic fields with that reduction. And then did you want to do the 2% budget cuts that's more of our custodial supply warehouse. It would then, we would not be replacing equipment as often because we would not have the funds for that. And it could impact our deep cleaning in the summertime because we do order materials prior to actually the summer doing our deep cleaning. But we would also see a little bit of that in our reduction of our services with our custodials. So we would see a little bit of savings anyway because we wouldn't be providing the same level of service in our schools.
Okay. Yep, Dr. Taylor.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Terry. I have a question on the 2% budget. Would that impact supplies or equipment?
It's a little bit of both. We do some equipment replacement with that, as well as supplies, cleaning supplies, but you could be talking about vacuums, extractors, those kind of things in the schools.
Thank you. Is it possible from an equipment standpoint to utilize WC1 funding? If we're talking about equipment, does that allow us to do that? Is that a little sketch?
I would say that's a good way of phrasing it.
Okay, it's a little sketch. Okay.
Yeah, that's a capital expenditure that meets the requirements.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, vacuum cleaners.
Thank you.
Yeah, they don't count for capital. Yeah, but good try. Thanks for playing. Yeah.
I want to follow the rules, but
That's good. No,
there's an opportunity.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so moving on to the 10% reduction. So like you heard from other departments, we will just be adding on to the 5%. So there's 3 additional reductions from the 5% reduction scenario, and these start getting very impactful. So the first one we'll talk about is we'd be reducing our custodial staff at the high school level. So I'm hoping that you received and you've had a chance to look at these more detailed analysis we put together that I think provides a lot more information than just the PowerPoint slide. But if you look at that, we would be going from basically right now at the high school level, a little under 31,000 square feet per custodian to 35,000 square feet per custodian. And just to remind the board, the national average is 24,800. So going significantly over. The other thing that's highlighted on that sheet is a fill rate. And I just kind of wanted to touch on that really fast because what we're seeing is a difficulty right now in filling positions custodial. I know we've talked a lot about transportation. We've talked about nutrition services, but we're facing the same thing custodial, and I know in many other departments also. The fill rate right now at elementary school is 37%, middle school is 13%, and high school is 11%. And what that means is that if someone calls in sick or someone's out for the day or whatever the situation is, like at the high school level right now, there's only 11% chance that we're going to be able to fill that position that day. So basically what you're seeing is they're doing without right now just because we do not have the staff to fill in. And also in previous budget cuts, we've also reduced the number of substitute custodians that we have as a district. So it's really kind of coming down to that critical level now where if someone calls in sick, it's probably not going to be filled.
And that's also hard on the team because every one of those custodians knows if I call in sick, it's a burden or the work won't get done. So I'll just go to work sick and that's not good either. We know they're hardworking and very loyal to the district and to one another, and that's a
To their
less than
schools.
ideal
To their
situation.
schools, yeah.
So to stay on that high school custodian cuts right now, the major impacts obviously are to the high schools, and we would be severely changing our process cleaning. Our process cleaning standards were developed in 2003 in conjunction with the Washoe County Health Department, and they were actually approved by this board. So I want to talk in detail about what we would be doing and what we would not be doing, because I think it's important for all of us, including the community, to understand. So the modified cleaning process for high schools will focus primarily on the disinfection of student desks and tables, removal of trash from the classrooms, restrooms, and assembly areas, and the sanitation of restrooms on a daily basis. Tasks such as vacuuming, mopping, dusting, and scouring of sinks will be on a rotation of approximately once to twice per week. So basically, probably be done on a wing basis. Do this wing, and then next day you're going to do this other wing. High school disinfection will not, and I got to emphasize, will not routinely include other high-touch area, non-flat high-touch areas such as door handles, doors, sinks, countertops, paper towel dispensers, phones, pencil sharpeners, light switches, teachers' desks, etc. So those things would no longer be done, and obviously you would know what the impact of that would be, obviously with our norovirus and other outbreaks that we receive as a district. The other major impact we're going to see at the high school level is coverage impacts for evening and weekend facility uses. We're just not going to have the staff to be able to do that on a routine basis. So that's the high school level cuts that we would be associated with a 10% reduction. The other one is more minor, which is a 0.5 FTE allocation to an administrative site. Right now here at the admin building we have 2.5 custodial positions that would be reduced down to 2. And then lastly, another significant cut would be to the gym floor refinishing. And that one is basically right now gym floors are currently refinished every other year at high schools and middle schools. So every other year they're refinished. Some schools have actually funded the material cost to have their gym floors done every year. But this $32,489 budget is basically just for the material costs, and that work has been done by the crews. But if we're going down this path, we're not going to have the staffing to be able to do that, and so this would mean that gym floors will no longer be refinished by facilities management and will need to be outsourced and funded by either the sites or the booster groups. And that, again, that personnel would be used to maintain other vacancies that we're having right now.
And those are not eligible for WC1 funding, the gym floor
No.
refinishing? Huh, okay.
And Pete,
Yeah. Trustee Kelly.
thank you, Madam President. Is it not eligible for WC1 funding because it hasn't been brought to the committee that reviews, or is it just not even eligible to go down that path?
Well, it has to be a capital expenditure that I think the timeline is 5 years. And so since we're refinishing these floors every other year and sometimes every year, it wouldn't meet the criteria of being a capital expenditure.
It's just routine maintenance. Okay.
So I can kind of jump into 20% because 20% is very similar, except I'm taking the high school impacts that I just read to you, and now those are going down to elementary school and middle school. The only difference I really want to talk about is when we get to the elementary school level, this level of staff reduction is really difficult because most of our schools only have one night custodian. So what you would have to do is reduce the hours from an 8-hour position down to a 6-hour position, and then the extra 2 hours would be spent by that custodian at a middle school or high school. But the productivity loss would be great because now we're having to pay that custodian to travel to a different site. We have to pay for mileage, and obviously we're having a lot of cut-up positions at different schools. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but when you only have one custodian in elementary school. But it's the same criteria I just read as far as not being able to disinfect the high-touch areas anymore and changing our cleaning process. With that, I'd be glad to answer any questions. I know these are painful ones.
Trustees? Just from my own sense, I think, we appreciate the identification of those first two items, the 2.5 elementary school custodians and the one 5.0 middle school custodian, I think that's fine. And I also think that we can certainly set the tone and set the example by having a reduction in service levels in the administrative area. I don't like anybody to be singled out, but I also think, if we're going to all have to suffer, we have to provide that kind of leadership. That's just, again, as one trustee. I'm not comfortable with the reduction of the cleaning process at high schools, because I think that's just penny wise and pound foolish, because we'll end up with more viral outbreaks. Trustee Caudill?
Yeah, this is going to sting. For me, I could support the 5%, but right now, given the uncertainty of our budget, I think it would be premature to even think about the 10% or the 20%. That's where I'm at.
Okay. Others? Dr. Taylor?
Thank you, Madam President. Excuse me. I could support the, very similar to you, the elementary school custodians, because, the enrollment will be different, and that just makes sense, as well as the middle school custodian. I don't like that, but that's sharing some of those, and that's some of the new middle schools that gets them in line. And then I agree wholeheartedly with the 0.5 on the admin level. That's pretty much all I'm comfortable with at this time.
Okay. Others? Trustee Kelly?
Thank you, Madam President. Yeah, I think I would support the 5% reduction, and I do have a question about that. If we were to reduce the elementary school custodial allocation by 2.5, is there any looking into older elementary schools would get the service that they need, and the newer elementary schools would be the ones that would then not get as much service because they're newer? Or is that more of just when you're newer school, the equipment's better, but you still have all the same cleanliness issues that an older elementary school would get? Do you see where I'm going with that?
Well, this 2.5 cut right now is strictly just because of the reduction in students at our most overcrowded schools. So we're talking Double Diamond and Browns. We're talking the schools that are all of a sudden being reduced because of the opening of Nick Polakidis. And so we're actually having less students. We're able to get rid of some of the portables. So we're just reducing square footage so we can reallocate that personnel. It is true that a new school takes a little less effort initially than an older school, just because it's brand new and everything in the school is brand new. But that quickly changes, and obviously we all know that if you own a new car and if you don't maintain it, that it doesn't look like a new car very long. So it's the same thing with one of our schools. So I'm not sure if there's really allocation difference right now from old to new. I think that this board and this district has done a great job for many, many years of saying in non-negotiables that we're going to keep our older schools looking clean. And I think they do. And I think I hear more compliments. I think that first day of school visits by staff saying that the schools really looked great. Now, like I said, last time we met, sometimes we couldn't maintain the things behind the walls, but at least the things that were visible to the public were maintained and clean. So I know it doesn't quite answer your question, but I don't think there's really a difference for us between new and old as far as the allocations. It's more on a square foot basis. Now, I hope as we go forward and more schools come online and we get rid of more and more portables, that we can start doing more of this shuffling to say we don't need as many custodian allocations at an existing school.
Mm-hmm. Vice President Raymond.
I just was hoping to get some clarity from my fellow trustees, because I'm not sure I'm hearing the same thing. Are some trustees saying they're okay with everything on the 5% list, and some trustees saying they're only okay with parts of the 5% list?
That's
okay.
What you're hearing so far. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I'll clarify mine. I'm good with the 5% list. In addition, I'm also good with the half admin. That wasn't on the 5% list. It was on the 10% list. But the 10% list as a total and the 20% list as a total for me right now is something that I wouldn't support at this time.
Perhaps one thing I'll just add really quick, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Is on the groundskeeper reduction summary, just so it's clear to the public and everyone. Right now, the current average acreage per groundskeeper is 25.75 acres. And with this increase, it would go to 34.33 acres, and the national average is 18. So we almost doubled the national average. So, it's fine to obviously do these, because I think, we're all facing these hard cuts, and we have to make, some huge sacrifices. But we also want the public to understand that grounds will not be maintained the same way. Neighbors need to understand grounds will not be picked up and trash removed as it has been in the past. And, that's the reality of it. When we're doing twice the national average, we're not going to be able to maintain things as well as they have been.
Yeah, I think when I was looking at the 5%, I really appreciate the work that was done to find the 176,000 and the custodial, and that I'm comfortable with. Not so comfortable with the groundskeeper, because I do feel like that impact is pretty significant. And I think that the 2% reduction in the warehouse supplies, I think is, it's not a large amount when you consider everything, but I think I'm more comfortable with it than the groundskeeper line. So I'm comfortable with the custodial and the warehouse, not the groundskeeper, and I also agree that the half-time admin, I think, should be part of that. So.
Okay. Trustee Calvert or Trustee Minetto, do you have any thoughts? I know you have thoughts. Any you want to share? Any you want to share?
I'd just like to say I pretty much
microphone?
agree
Microphone on? Yeah.
Oh, I pretty much agree with Melina. I believe that groundskeeping is important because, a lot of that stuff does carry germs or whatever, and if we're just leaving it out there, then we're just adding to the potential of people getting sick and all that kind of a thing. So a lot of what Melina has said, I would have to agree with her on.
Okay. Trustee Minetto.
And it's like the face of the school district. It's what people see first. So I feel like it's a PR thing as well.
Well, and it's also being a good neighbor. You raised the issue of the neighbors who are adjacent to our schools, and I also understand that there's another side to that PR, which is we do have people who say, well, look, everything's just hunky-dory, it's beautiful, it's perfect, and yet we have class sizes that are too big. So, it does go both ways. You're right. It is the face, it is the image and the presence of the school. But I think that's a huge hit to ask our groundskeepers to be doing 34 acres per and average is 18. Dr. Taylor, I'm struggling with that one.
Thank you, Madam President. And if I had to pick and choose, I guess I would be more likely to go with supplies than with the groundskeeper as well. My thinking on the grounds is that has a direct relationship with how students feel about their environment, how teachers feel about their environment. When you look around and things are well kept and it feels clean and so on, that has a direct impact. And we want students to go to school and feel like their buildings matter, their environments matter. And when you have things laying around and trash and things aren't lined when you go to PE and then there are no lines on the field, so you're trying to make up how you play soccer and those kinds of things, it sends a message that it isn't important, which therefore they see as they aren't important. And so I'm more concerned about how the students take that, and I also think it's important for the teachers, for the staff as well.
Pete, did we, or Tammy, did we look at any of the suggestions that community members brought forward to engage students, perhaps leadership classes at schools, in being more active in owning the appearance of their school and doing some of that pickup? Did we look into any of that?
We didn't go out and actively ask them, but I know through the high schools and that they do have their groups that go in and clean up. They have recycle that happens at the schools, and they they take care of their schools, and they care about that. And there's just some of it that there's so much of it that we need to be able to help them with our grounds and that. But we could definitely reach out to them. It's a case-by-case basis with the high schools and middle schools, and somebody's got to champion that. And those leadership groups generally do and really care about their schools.
The other item, I'm sorry, the other item that we did talk about was the community work crews, and I know they came up. And I mean, that brings in a lot of issues. I know when I was at the city of Sparkside, we ran community work crews, and I know what it takes to run those. But having those on our school grounds during school times, I don't think is probably a precedent we want to set. And also just getting those amount of work crews on our sites is difficult. I can tell you that you have to have a full-time person that actually picks them up in the morning, supervises them during the day, takes them back in the evenings. And it's just a difficult proposition that we'd have to look into more detail, but I don't see it probably being real feasible at the school level.
What about the juvenile probation work crews? They have a significant work program, and the kids do a lot of, vandalism, repairs, and that sort of thing. I know it's not enough to support the entire district, but again, these are also things that are symbolic. That we're owning some of these problems. It just might be something to check into, because they have full-time work crew supervisors at the juvenile level. And those kids do get sentenced, if you will, to hours of community service. And what better way? I know they've painted schools in the past, long ago when I was there in another lifetime. But just might be something to see if that could be a piece that could be defrayed. And again, it's a small piece, but it's also a symbolic piece.
We can actually absolutely look into that.
Okay. I don't know if anyone wants to make a motion. I know we're kind of split on the groundskeepers at this point, but maybe Dr. Taylor?
Thank you. I'm your girl.
You're my woman.
I'm your woman.
My BFF. That's right.
I am prepared to make a motion, Madam President. I move that the board, and I'm losing my notes, so here we are. I move that the board accepts the recommendation to eliminate 2.5 elementary school custodians, 1 middle school custodian, a half FTE of the admin custodian, and 2% reduction in the supply warehouse.
Okay, is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, second by Vice President Raymond. Okay. Is there other discussion on that? Okay. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay, and again, if you can come up with some more ways we can attack that groundskeeping issue, I think we're all ears. Okay, thank you. Let's see, where are we now?
So I think before we turn to other district funds, we probably want to bring closure to the general fund discussion and talk about the athletic transportation fees, if we could.
Okay, so let's get back on that page if we could.
Sorry.
So I think what we heard was that we have at least 3 different options to consider, and these are not the only 3 options
Right.
we would consider.
Right.
We do have concerns. I did hear concerns about the 100%, and I don't think there's any appetite for that one. And I also am sensitive to that even 50% is difficult for some students. We did hear very appropriately an encouragement that we develop some sort of system for capturing more of those potentially uncollectible revenues. Again, we don't want to disenfranchise any deserving student or needy student from being able to participate. But if we could just have some more rigor around what the policy would be there. So I think what staff is looking for is what level of cost recovery would we be comfortable with, and does that mean per athlete or per sport? So let's have that. Yeah, I think Vice President Raymond had her. Oh, okay. Go ahead, Dr. Taylor.
Thank you, Madam
My
President.
BFF.
Thank you, Madam President, BFF. My question would be, and I know we don't have numbers to this, but I'm uncomfortable with the $68. It's just such a large increase on the high school side. So is there, I'm like, Madam President, I can't do these numbers in my head real quickly, but perhaps if the middle school fee went, say, from $5 to $10, because it's a lower number, and then we could adjust the high school fee to make it something less than 68. right? I know that would get us, that would take us away from the 50% because of the numbers. I mean, there are more numbers inherent in high school participation than middle school. But that's just such a large, I would be much more comfortable with a $45 fee or $50 fee or something like that at the high school level.
Maybe 10 at middle school and 50 at
Yes,
high school.
I would be more comfortable with something like that. Again, I'm not married to those numbers, but I could land there and live with it. That's my thinking, Madam President.
Other thoughts?
Doing the math.
Everybody has their calculator out. And that would be, you're suggesting on a per athlete basis, not on a per sport basis?
That was on a just a per athlete basis, because that also, as Trustee Caudill mentioned, it's looking at if you're doing debate or student council or any of those others,
Right.
Cheerleaders or whatever. That would you pay a fee, you pay one fee.
Right. So what does that give us?
That would produce $100,000 more in revenue. So we'd go from $205,000 currently to $305,000.
What percentage would we land at?
Be a little less than 50%
Right.
for cost recovery. 305 of 785, whatever that is. Is that what you said? 305? It would give us,
305 to 205. So let me.
Yeah, 305.
About 30, almost 40, yeah.
Yeah.
About 40%.
Yeah,
Yeah,
39.
37%.
It's between 35 and 40. I got
Yeah.
39. 38.8 was what I got. Yes, Mr. Caudill.
So the numbers are based on what we think we can get based on the current percentages of revenue received. So if we do put in place something that would encourage the fees to be paid, we would get more without increasing it as much, if that makes
Correct.
sense. So, yeah, in addition to the sixth graders, so I'm comfortable with what Dr. Taylor was discussing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Ready for it?
Wait, is there any more discussion before we have a motion? Okay. Okay, go ahead.
I move with the Board of Trustees increase the athletics fee and activities fee per student,
The transportation fee.
the transportation fee per student in the middle school level to $10 and at the high school level to $50.
Okay, and that also includes taking a look at how we can improve collections. Can you add that? Sure.
And to also take a look at improving the rate of collection.
Okay, and the seconder agrees with that. Okay. Is there any other discussion on that? And again, thank you for the analysis, and we know that this is these are challenging impacts on our students, so we don't do this lightly. Okay, any further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. All right, thank you.
Madam President, do we
Yes,
need something
ma'am.
on the other thing that we started with, including the 3% COLA? Do we need something?
I think he's coming back to that.
Okay.
Yeah. Oops, what do you need?
The area superintendent budget, did we take
We didn't
action on that one?
finalize that. Thank you for the reminder on that. Yeah. And what did we do on, we did do the chief of police, but we did not do the Office of School Leadership. Okay. Is there a motion on the Office of School Leadership? Okay, it's slide 34. Trustee Kelly?
Can we do maybe a quick refresher then on what that cost savings, and then I can make a motion, but.
So here, let me pipe in. So area superintendent's budget pay for things within their school budgets that sometimes schools can't pay for. They pay for their area meetings. They basically pick up the tab where schools can't pick up tabs. For example, if a school needed extra help to pay for buses, right? if we didn't pay for the buses, then the area superintendent would sometimes kick in. It could be for books, for professional learning. It's just a cost that would not be incurred by the school. And resources to kids, like some of it goes to resources to kids.
Trustee Kelly or Vice President Raymond, I don't know which one of you wanted to speak first. Trustee Kelly? Okay. Yeah, okay. Vice President Raymond.
The area where I've seen this is in the budget transfer reports. I always noticed that line for some reason is the one that stands out the most, is when the area superintendents, I think sometimes because I see it's going to one of the schools in my district or something, in terms of the spending. And so I have noticed it is like long-term subs and things that we discussed earlier, but I've also noticed often the total amount being transferred is like $2,000, so for one school. And so the 20% reduction feels manageable in a sense, because when I've seen that transfer on that report, it's significantly more per quarter than this amount, it seems like. I know we lost Kristen, so I don't know if there's I'd be interested in knowing what the total, so is the 20% reduction, that's the total budget for all 4 area superintendents?
Well, the total cost is that would be
100% of the 50
is 56,837.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's I'm comfortable with it. I know it will be impactful. All of this is impactful. I think appropriately the area superintendents and the schools use this almost as contingency funds for little things, and we're in the realm of we are cutting things. It's I know it's going to have an impact. I don't take it lightly. I also think that because it's sort of a contingency fund, they are things that we haven't identified as being absolutely necessary in the budget going forward for that school. So I'm comfortable with the 20%. Did you have something, Soup?
No.
Okay. Trustee Kelly?
Thank you, Madam President. Before I make the motion, I'm also comfortable with the 20% reduction because it's also kind of an equity issue. I mean, an area superintendent that has this money is using it to help maybe certain schools and not other schools, and just by reducing it 20%, I mean, to me that's just a little bit more equitable, because some schools aren't being impacted and others are. So I'm prepared to make a motion that the Board of Trustees reduces by 20% the total cost of 20% reduction for each of the 4 area superintendents' budgets for schools through the Office of School Leadership.
Okay, we have a motion by Trustee Kelly, second by Trustee Mineta. We have some discussion and some late breaking news from the Soup's text.
We love late breaking news. Troy is on his way up. Part of what I did not discuss was intercession money credit recovery. So I'm hoping Troy is coming around this corner to have a discussion to go deeper into how they spend their money. Because I went global, they get specific, and it's differentiated from school to school because we know some schools PTAs can raise money to do things and some schools can't. So that money helps offset that, some of those things in an equitable model. Hello.
Come on down, Dr. Parks.
Dr. Parks.
Come on down. Just go straight to the mic. You got it. Oops, you have to turn the... There we go. It's on.
Thank you.
It's on. Yeah.
Good afternoon, President Simon Holland, Superintendent Davis, board members. I understand there was a question about our budgets.
Well, it was there's a motion actually on the table to go with the 20% reduction proposed, which would reduce each of the 4 area superintendents' budgets for schools by $2,841.75 for a total of $11,367. And we absolutely recognize this does impact things. It hits a lot of levels, and it's also, these are almost like contingencies where we didn't have it in the budget originally for that school, and an area superintendent recognizes a need and allocates it. So there is a motion on the table, and we just wanted to give you an opportunity to respond, or to Sue, or whoever wants to. Yes, Dr. Taylor.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Dr. Parks. Would you just give the board a little more insight on how the area soups utilize this funding? What are the kinds of things? We knew that globally they help schools, they do books and so on, but the soup was sharing with us that there's sometimes more specific things, if it's intercession, if it's what. Just give us an idea of what these funds are
How
usually.
you support schools with that money so they understand your budgets outside of like subs, what you do, the little things that pop up in buildings.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay, so to start with, this year with our focus on equity, we bought across the district, every principal and administrators, the book Opening Doors, and that was been our focus about diving deep into equity work, and that's common across all the areas. So we'll often do something like that. We've been talking about, what are the next steps for equity next year, and that will probably be another book and diving deeper. Some of the, I would qualify them as contingencies. Often there's a need for long-term subs, and we have to help a school get through a period of time where we help pay for that long-term sub, especially our schools that we call the challenge schools, where they're not a Title I school, so they don't get extra funding, and they're not a high socioeconomic status school, so we really help them out. Sometimes we have situations where an administrator needs to move to go cover another school. We've had to do that. And then we have to, what we call backfill, and we sometimes help cover those costs. Oftentimes, professional learning that is taking place at a school, for example, our acceleration schools, we will meet with them 3 times a year, and we go really deep into their student achievement data and talk about strategies and focus to improve. We may have those. We usually provide lunch for principals, and it's a working lunch. A lot of things like that. Sometimes principals will need a new computer because they're moving to a new site, and they don't have site funds there to get a new computer. We'll cover those. Really as a as-needed basis. I normally try to get the principal to split it 50-50 with me, so I know that they're not just asking me for money all the time. But those are some scenarios that we use.
So we would still, just for trustees' clarification and yours too, Dr. Parks, we would still be, as I understand this, there would still be $45,500 in that budget item, because we would be taking 11,000 away from 56. Is that what the proposal is? Okay. All right. Dr. Taylor?
Thank you, Madam President. Dr. Parks, is intercession, credit recovery, any of those things, is that included in this, or?
Not usually. Those are separate funds that principals have access to those prior to the school year, and they know what their budgets are for those. So normally, unless there was in addition to, it wouldn't come out of these funds.
Okay. Thank you.
So we have a motion on the table, and we have a second, and we've had some discussion. I think we should go ahead and vote, and we'll see how that motion goes, and then if we have to make another motion, we'll do that. Okay. So all in favor of the motion to adopt the 20% reduction for the 4 area superintendents' budgets? All in favor? Please signify. Any opposed? Motion carries. Okay. Sorry, Dr. Parks, we're just, I know it's a hardship on everyone, but we're looking under every rock. So.
No, we completely understand.
And thank you.
cannot be easy on your side either.
It is
So
definitely not.
we
Thank
get
you,
it.
and please tell the area superintendents we do so appreciate the work, so thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, all right, back to you, Mr. Mathers.
Yeah, so before we go to the direction on the tentative budget and the COLA, the one hanging issue or somewhat hanging issue I thought I heard or that we've had discussions on is the bell schedule.
Yes, thank you.
And
the famous, infamous Rick Martin is here, And David, I don't know if you want to say anything about that as well.
Sure. David Lasik, Chief of Staff for the record, and with me, Rick Martin, Director of Transportation, and we kind of had a powwow about it this morning just to check in on that. Schools have already started communicating to parents their schedules. They did make some tweaks already for next year, but they've already started communicating those times for next school year, so we'd be hesitant to do anything at this point. Plus, from a communication standpoint, it would be a big lift for us to do something and get the feedback needed to implement this for next school year. So our recommendation is to do it, but take the time to do the community input and do it for the 2020-2021 school year.
What about January? Implementing mid-year, how much would that make everyone crazy? I mean, I really appreciate the work you all did to look at that, and I think it's an imperative that we get there, and it's such a big savings. It's just really hard to wait, a year and a half before we can implement it.
I understand that from Rick, again,
Yes.
for the record, Rick Martin, Director of Transportation. From the standpoint of continuity for the students, continuity for the parents, you're going to be dealing with a bunch of issues that if you're changing bell times, and some of those times will be drastic, comparatively 45, 50 minutes, maybe in some cases an hour on the elementary level. From that standpoint, you're going to be dealing with their situations with sitter care, after school issues, all of those types of things. And you try you try to implement that mid-year. I know I'll get those phone calls. It depends on how much you're willing to pay for therapy. So and go from there.
You still have a lot of hair, Rick. I just want to say.
It's a wig, but
it is lighter. Okay, all right. I'm convinced. And part of our job is just to ask the questions and to have these discussions on the record and to evaluate every possibility. And David and I have had conversations about, if this was going to take this long, why did we not talk about this until March and April? But here we are. Here we are. And so it looks like that is not going to be a savings amount that we are able to realize this year or for next year. Okay, unless anybody wants to go ahead. I think we're being advised that would not be. Good luck with that. Yeah, not be good. Okay, all right, thank you. David, it was great hearing from you too. So, yes, Trustee Cotto.
How much of a savings are we talking about doing that? Ballpark?
Yeah, 400,000.
400,000.
386 or something. Yeah.
So in a worst case scenario, we could do a point where we get close to that balance mark, and then know that in the second half of the budget cycle, the 2 years, we would have that savings, I guess.
Correct. In the biennium, correct. Okay, yes,
Ma'am,
Dr. Taylor?
Madam President, just add then that we take this up as soon as possible for the following school year so that we have the opportunity to get the feedback from parents, and they may have some other ideas and suggestions and do all the work that's necessary. But if we can bring that up sooner, just with the caveat of that, then so we don't find ourselves in a position where we can't make a decision.
And I'd still like to have the broader discussion that's not just about the transportation-related bell schedules, but what we hear from the middle schoolers and the families about start times, too. I think there is a broader discussion, and I'd love to have that conversation as soon as possible so we can have lots of lead time and give plenty of time for community input. Anything else on that, David? Okay. All right.
Thank you. I just wanted to make that a part of our direction.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam President.
Oh, good. Legal counsel's back.
Yes, I'm back. What do you have?
Vice President Raymond.
I'm sorry, I just, before we move on away from that bell schedule, my feeling is that it also needs to be, and I know that you all recognize this, but I don't think that, well, we know change is hard for people, and I don't think that the feedback will be good one way or the other from many of our elementary school parents. But I just think as much as we can impress upon the savings and the difficult position we're in with these choices, and that it's, you know, that is why we're looking at this in many respects, is because of the challenges we're having, I guess. I just know that it's a hard conversation to have no matter what, and the one thing I don't like about it is taking away the autonomy for schools to know their, you know, parents and families and what's right for them. And so I think it's one of the multitude of hard options that we're looking at here. And, you know, we had great budget forums where we discussed some of these other hard things, and I see it as in a similar vein as that, you know, it's part of the budgeting process, something we're looking at, and not just a convenience for the school district to have everybody on the same bell system.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yep, good, thank you. And because we're not taking any action on that, I don't think we need to take any action. I'm not the legal counsel, but we don't need to have a vote on that, to take no action. Okay.
I think that's all I have on my list of hanging items, and so unless my staff has any other items, or you have any.
What about the advanced placement stipends?
Oh, we removed that.
Okay.
We, in talking with Debbie Beiersdorf, understood the importance of that, and so we've removed that.
Okay.
And so now I would be looking for a motion on direction for the tentative budget to include the 3% COLA and make any other changes that we haven't talked about, if that's the board's pleasure, so that then we can go back, adjust the tentative budget, and file that with the state by the 15th.
Do we need to go through any of the rest of the
I'm sorry.
packet?
Yeah, we should. Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because that does, I mean,
Yes,
we're
part of the
talking
tentative
about the
budget.
general fund,
Yeah.
but they are part of the tentative budget, so.
Thank you, Trustee Holland. We do have other funds in the district other than the general fund, which gets all the attention, but our building and sites fund essentially accounts for any sales of assets we have. We collect money for cell towers. That's all this is representing right now, and the use of those funds by the various schools. If we do actually sell a property, you can have the opportunity to augment your budget to use those funds.
Do we not have any sites that we expect to sell in the next year?
We do, but rather than kind of pre-budget those dollars, we would prefer just to augment the budget once we do sell a property.
Okay.
And know that dollar amount.
Okay, and again, those funds would be restricted for the Building and Sites Fund, and we can't use them in any other way. We can't use them to offset the general fund deficit. Those sales of assets, real property assets, are carved off.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So capital projects is a very big fund, obviously, with WC1 and the ability to issue bonds there. The biggest line item here would be sale of bonds. We're proposing a $75 million issue for rollover bonds and $285 million in WC1 bonds. Those are cover the Wild Creek High School projects, Swope and O'Brien Middle School, Cold Springs Elementary School, and HUG repurposing and some land acquisition.
So the 360 that's in the sale of bonds for fiscal year 20 is the 75 plus the 255, okay, or 285, gotcha, okay.
Yes. Special revenue funds, these are basically state and federal grants. There's an increase here. It's mostly due to the level of funding we actually have in the current year. It's really hard to project for fiscal year 20, especially given it's all going to be based on what the legislature approves. So in the interim, what's budgeted is not what we plan on spending. What we actually get is what we will spend. and hopefully it's within these lines, but until we get there, it's really hard to say.
Okay. Do we have any that are terminating that we know of that won't be continued by the state or other?
I'm not aware
sources?
of any big federal ones. I mean, we've had TIF 4 funding that went away last year and caused
right.
a big impact. At this point in time, there's not major ones like that.
Okay, no indication of that anyway. Okay.
And with special education fund, you see that it goes up like $3.5 million almost. And really, everything we talked about with the general fund impacts this fund. It's the same thing with the roll-ups in salary, health insurance increase, salary increases, and the PERS change. So we do recognize about 1.4 million more in revenue. That still has to be approved by this state and the legislature. But that increases our general fund contribution or our transfer from the general fund to the special education fund by 2.1 million.
Okay. Before we get to the next one, have you all been keeping track of what the dollar net change is that we have approved so far? And if you haven't, then yeah, we'll get to that when we're finished with this. Okay.
And class size reduction fund is what a state special appropriation for reducing class sizes in grades 1 through 3. The amount of funding we actually get will depend on our class enrollment for those grades, which won't be determined until next fall. But right now, just assuming we get the same number, you're playing a roll-up in salary and health insurance increases here. So we would see a little bit of increased funding based on that, and that obviously just goes to pay for those costs.
Okay.
Debt service, this is a combination of our regular debt service, which is really paying rollover bonds and other medium-term financing, and our WC1 debt service, which right now we've issued our second one. So we have about, I believe, 16 million or about 18 million in interest payments for those bonds proposed for fiscal year 20. The big item here you see is transfer in about $48 million. Really, that's funds that we have set aside in our capital projects fund. So it's those sales tax collections that have been there, and they're really there to either pay for pay-as-you-go projects or pay off debt service. So we're just transferring a big portion of that funding that's sitting in the capital projects fund over here to pay for future debt service. And this regular debt service would include an anticipated amount to pay for the $360 million in bonds that we've talked about too, or the WC1 debt service and the regular debt service. Internal service funds are funds we house internally for paying for property, casualty insurance, health insurance, and workers' comp insurance. We're not really changing any of the rates other than for health insurance. Health insurance includes a 10% increase, as we've talked about. And when we get to the combined ending fund balance or net position, you see goes up quite substantially versus the prior year. It's not because of this 10%. During the fiscal year 18 audit, we had to shift some monies that were included in our OPEB trust fund over to the health insurance trust fund. So you see that opening net position in the health insurance fund is over 50 million of that amount. Over 34 million of that is really the shifting of the OPEB funds. So that is not available to use for health insurance purposes in this fund. It's more restricted for OPEB purposes, but we had to include it here. But when you back that out of the combined closing net position, we would finish a little above your 16% required fund balance for these funds.
Required fund balance is 16%?
While the board policy.
Well, the board policy is 10% for the general fund too, but it doesn't save us anything anywhere else to reduce the fund balance here. Okay. Yeah.
And we'll update the Nutrition Services Fund. It's about this time of year where they usually give us their latest proposal. So for the final budget, that'll be updated. I believe the net income is really their guarantee for what they believe the fund will make. And I think it'll be closer to 600,000 than this 270. And you see that, once again, opening net position, there's a big negative number there. That's because of new GASB statements related around recognizing pension liability.
Government
like
Accounting Standards Board.
Oh, yes, sorry.
No, it's okay.
Governmental Accounting Standards Board, GASB. Anyway, we have to reflect that in this fund because it's an enterprise fund.
Okay. So, yeah, you go ahead and do the timeline, and then we'll talk about how we haven't really gained any ground at all. If we have to take the bell schedules out, we didn't even make it to 400 in cuts, so we're farther behind than we were when we sat down.
That's
please
good
go
math.
ahead.
Yes, that's about where I got us. So, yeah, it's probably adding back about almost $50,000 by the time you take the reductions that you have mentioned and everybody approved and add back the bell schedule. It's pretty much net zero.
And we don't know how much the police officer overtime exactly was, or we didn't have what the 0.5 admin custodian value was, but we had the athletic transportation, $100,000, $11,367 from the assistant superintendent's budgets, the police officer's overtime, which we don't know, $176,085 from the elementary school and middle school custodians, $16,026 from the 2% warehouse reduction, and then the half admin custodian, half FTE. So we don't know what the amount is, but yeah, so. Okay.
So we have to file a tentative budget by April 15th. Our internal policy is to bring it to you guys for your approval. And we can make these changes and get it in by the April 15th date, whatever your final recommendations are. After that, we have to have a hearing on the tentative budget, and right now that's tentatively scheduled for, I believe, May 28th. And if that isn't enough time to incorporate everything that happens at the end of the legislature, which typically it isn't, we can file an amended final budget 30 days after the end of the legislative period. And in the interim, we've talked about gathering a lot of information, bringing it back to you to make further decisions about the budget, and hopefully we get a lot more information about our funding level and see where it all ends up.
So if we could just again have a clarification of I know you provided it, we can just go back and look at the inclusion of the 3% and the reductions that we have talked about today. The inclusion of the 3% is that 8 million? 8.32 million, okay. So we are basically net neutral on the reductions we've made today. We're still looking at a $17.76 million budget deficit, and that assumes that we will get relief on the charter school equity allocation. Okay. So staff is looking for a motion to that effect. Dr. Taylor, bless your heart. Bless your ever-loving heart.
Yeah. You know, in the South, that doesn't mean anything positive, right? It does not. It does not.
Your motion-making heart.
There we are. Madam President, I move that the board approves as our tentative budget, which includes the 3% COLA for educators, which leads
for staff.
For staff. When I said educators, I thought that meant I was including everybody.
So that everybody else
Let's
knows.
just say all staff, so everyone knows. For all staff, all district staff, which will lead us to have an overall deficit of $17.76 million.
And we do so with,
consternation.
okay. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Vice President Raymond. Is there other discussion?
I do want to say this, just because it's with consternation, that doesn't mean at all. I mean, since I've making the motion, I think it's important, let's go on record that we're all for the 3% COLA for all staff. The consternation is because of the deficit, not because of the increase. I think so somewhere in this, I think it's important for us as a board to reflect that we are fully supportive of the 3% increase, just challenged by our budget deficit.
Trustee Cottle, we're still in discussion on the motion.
Yeah, I agree with that. My only concern is if we don't get the funding, and then we have to cut $17.76 million, when we just essentially have to cut 3% we've already said we're going to give.
Or we go down in our fund balance, and that's what's proposed in the tentative budget, that we reduce the fund balance, which is also not a welcome action to take. Before we vote, I do want to thank the staff for all of the hard work to go through this process with great attention and great commitment to what's best for students. None of us like having to cut anything from this budget because we know that it affects somebody. It affects a student, it affects a staff member, it affects a family. And I just want to thank everyone for their diligence in meeting our statutory responsibility to do this. I do want to say, in response to your comment, Trustee Caudill, yes, it is an option that we would come back and cut $17.76 million. I think we've gotten to the point here where we're seeing those cuts would be so dramatic, and we certainly can evaluate them when we get to we get more information from what shows up in the economic forum, when we find out legislative intent with regard to whether we have to keep up with categorical funding or we have some more flexibility. Some of those things may help us, and will reduce that 17.76 amount. And then we may get to a point where we have to decide, do we just reduce our fund balance so drastically? So those decisions are still to be made, and good to point it out, and I don't want to assume that we won't make more cuts, because we certainly have that before us. Vice President Raymond?
Thank you. My question is that, are we penalized in any way? Is there any issue with presenting a tentative budget that takes us below that 4% fund balance? Do we need to come up, was it $2.5 million that gets us above that at some point? What are the, I guess, maybe next steps if we do present this?
So it's a very good question, and I have the same question. So I asked the Department of Taxation, we can submit a budget with a fund balance below that 4%, but we have to provide an explanation. And so I think the explanation, at least right now, would be we do plan on revisiting numbers in May and adopting a final budget or adjusted budget in June that would have us above the 4%. I think, right, that would be our intention. So that is legally possible, and it's been done. And I don't think we're going to be the only school district in the state in that situation.
Okay. Yep. Can you remind me what that textbook number was?
$6 million.
$6 million.
Okay. And that's not included?
No.
So that's still something to consider?
Yes.
Okay.
Correct. So we do, it's not all, this isn't the end of the conversation. It's not all a disastrous result. This is our tentative. This is where we are today with the information that we have. These are the choices that we're able to make today. Dr. Taylor?
Thank you, Madam President. I would just like to add, we're also in RFP for our health insurance. And who knows, we may realize some savings there as well. So there are several things out there that could save us, help us anyway.
Make it a little bit less.
It won't save us, but it may help us.
Okay. Any further comments? Hearing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Okay, thank you, trustees, for your diligent attention to this, and thank you, staff, again, for all of the good work to try to pull a rabbit out of the hat here. Okay, we don't even have a hat. Is there any public comment at this moment? Do we have any public comment? Okay, then we will go ahead and adjourn the work session and see everyone back here at 2 o'clock. Not everyone, but see the trustees back here at 2 o'clock. Okay, thank you.